Sa pagsapit ng dilim, ako'y naghihintay pa rin sa iyong magang pagdating. Pagkat ako'y nababalisa kung di ka kapiling, bawat sandali mahalaga sa atin. Tulad ng ibong malaya ang pag-ibig natin, tulad ng langit na kay sarap marating. Ang bawat tibok ng puso'y kay sarap damhin, tulad ng imig na kay sarap awitin. Na 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 na. Na 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 na. Na 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 na. At ngayon ikaw ay nagbalik sa aking piling, luha ng pag-ibig kay sarap haplusin. Tulad ng tubig sa batis, hinakan ng hangin. Pag-ibig ang ilaw sa buhay natin. Tulad ng ibong malaya ang pag-ibig natin, tulad ng langit na kay sarap marating. Ang bawat tibok ng puso'y kay sarap damhin, tulad ng imig ng pag-ibig natin. Nananarat, 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 la 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 la. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was, let's all give another round of applause to the Mount Apo Project, led by Ateneo's very own Dr. Erickson Batikan. And they're requesting an encore, so may we request the Mount Apo Project to regale us with one more song before we proceed with the afternoon session of this event. Ladies and gentlemen, again, the Mount Apo Project.
You can sing with me if you know the lyrics. This is a very familiar song. When the night has come and the land is dark, and the moon is the only light we'll see. No, I won't be afraid. No, I won't be afraid. Just as long as you stand by me. So darling, darling, stand by me. Oh, stand by me. Oh, stand by. Stand by me. Stand by me. If the sky that we look upon should tumble and fall, all the mountains should crumble to the sea, I won't cry, no I won't shed a tear, just as long as you stand by me. Come on, sing with me. And darling, darling, stand, come on, by me. Oh, stand by me. Oh, stand by. Stand by me. Stand by me. So darling, darling, stand by me. Whoa, stand by. Stand by me. Whoa, stand by. Stand by me. Stand by me. When the night has come and the land is dark and the moon is the only light we'll see, no, I won't be afraid. No, I won't be afraid. Just as long as you stand by me. So darling, darling, stand by me. Whoa, stand by me. Whoa, stand by. Stand by me. Stand by me. So darling, darling, stand by me. Whoa, stand by. Stand by me. Whoa, stand by. Stand by me. Stand by me. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Mount Apo Project. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. For those who weren't here in the morning, allow me to reiterate that we are today celebrating the International Month of Peace, and as such, the Ateneo de Davao University is hosting this high summit on security sector transformation and prospects for post-conflict Philippines, and it is a joint initiative of the Center of Psychological Extension and Research Services, or COPERS, and the Al-Kalam Institute, as well as being convened by the Eastern Mindanao cluster of the Bantay Bayanihan and the Office of the Presidential Advisor on the Peace Process. This morning, we had speakers such as, of course, no less than the Governor of the Province of Davao del Norte, Governor Rodolfo del Rosario, former Anak Mindanao Party List Representative, Mr. Ariel Hernandez, as well as other reactors and panelists. This afternoon, we are honored to have with us to start the afternoon session. But before that, may I call on Professor Haji Balahadja for a few announcements. All right, since he's not here right now, moving on. To start the afternoon session, to talk about updates on the peace process, may I call on, and let us all welcome, the Assistant Secretary of the Office of the Presidential Advisor on the Peace Process, Assistant Secretary Jennifer Santiago Ureta. Let's all give her a round of applause.
Good afternoon. In the program, it's listed there that I only have 20 minutes. Supposedly started 1:25 and supposed to end by 45. I have prepared about 60 slides, so I don't know how I'm going to do that, but I will try my best to give you an informative update and at the same time keep up with the time given to me. So the title, the very sexy title of my presentation is Updates on the Peace Process. I am coming from, next slide please. So I'm coming from the Office of the Presidential Advisor on the Peace Process, and just very quickly to review. The mandate of OPAP is to oversee, coordinate, and integrate the implementation of the comprehensive peace process. This is this is based on the Executive Order number 3, series of 2001. Next slide, please. Under the Philippine Development Plan, the chapter on peace and security, you also will find the strategy of the government as regards the peace process. Next slide. And in this particular chapter of the Philippine Development Plan, there is a discussion there about the intention of the government of winning the peace. And when we say winning the peace, basically it is the promotion of the peace process being the centerpiece of the internal security program of the government. And there is a recognition also in that chapter that peace is not simply an absence of war or conflict, but it is really the sum total of the conditions that ensure human and social well-being in all dimensions. Next slide. Basically, the goal of the government in terms of the peace process is to bring all armed conflict to a permanent and peaceful solution. And more particularly, next slide please. The objectives basically is a negotiated political settlement of armed conflict and causes of armed conflict and other issues that affect the peace process are effectively addressed. Now, let me labor a bit about this with this slide. The first bullet talks about what we call track 1. The negotiated political settlement of armed conflict basically deals with the government and the government or the state and the non-state armed group. In other words, the first bullet simply talks about or attempts to address what we call the vertical conflict, the state and the non-state. The second bullet, on the other hand, is what we call the complementary track. It actually intends to create a positive condition so that the peace negotiation or track 1 actually continues. So you will see there that, and while it is only a few lines, basically it carries with it a lot of interface and convergence and efforts that need to be done in order to address the causes of armed conflict. Next slide. Now, this is just an illustration of what I have discussed earlier. So the government strategy with regard to the peace process, basically, as I've said, is track 1 and and complementary track. Track 1, as I've said, is the negotiated political settlement. The complementary track, on the other hand, is forging strategic partnerships and collaboration among agencies so that development, security, and governance are actually felt on the ground, especially communities affected by conflict. So these two must work side by side and hand in hand. In other words, you cannot have a track 1 without a complementary track working alongside the political settlement. Next slide. Now, right now, the OPAP is managing 5 peace tables. And let me emphasize that, 5 peace tables. The more controversial and perhaps the more, or the tables that are always seen on the news basically would be the MILF, the MNLF, and of course the CPP-NPA. But in fact, we are managing 5 peace tables, and I will try to go very quickly with this or to give an update as regards these 5 tables. Next slide. So the framework agreement of the on the Bangsamoro, this is the table with the government and the MILF. Okay? And I am only beginning with the MILF precisely because this is the most known, or this is the most talked about because of because it is the one that is actively being negotiated. The framework agreement was signed last October 15, 2012. So we are nearing the first year anniversary of the signing of the framework agreement. It was finalized on the 13th meeting between the panels, the government panel and the MILF panel. Next slide. Basically, the framework agreement on the Bangsamoro, or the FAB or FAB, basically puts together what we call a roadmap. And you will see there the 4 major milestones that we are looking at based on the framework agreement. Number 1 is the creation of the Transition Commission, and it should be created by an executive order, and that it has already been created, okay? It has already been created. The second milestone is that the basic law will be passed by Congress, okay? The framework agreement and the annexes that are being negotiated at the moment will be converted by the Transition Commission. Okay, just to give you how the 4 dots there connect. The framework agreement that are still being negotiated right now will be converted by the Transition Commission into a proposed law. Okay, a proposed law. After which it will be submitted to Congress. Congress will pass it, assuming that no quirks happen and assuming that the entire Congress are one with the administration on this. So Congress will pass the basic law. When the basic law is passed, that's when we put together a transition authority, or the Bangsamoro Transition Authority, to replace the ARMM. What is the function or what is the relevance of creating a Bangsamoro Transition Authority? It is to bridge the current to the Bangsamoro government that will be constituted by 2016. In other words, these milestones have dates. Transition Commission should have been, the target of the Transition Commission is this year, okay, 2013. The basic law's target is 2014. Transition Authority is 2015, and as I've said, it will try to bridge the 2015 until the 2016, when we have the first election in the Bangsamoro government. Next slide. This is the proposed territory. And again, it only will become part of the territory when the people, or if the people approves it in a plebiscite. Okay? So let me emphasize that. This is the proposal, but it can only happen if the people approves it in a plebiscite. Next slide. Now, we are right now negotiating still the annex on power sharing. Just for the information of everyone, the framework agreement that was signed last October 15 is just the basic or the mother document. Right now, to go with the mother document would be the 4 annexes: the annex on power sharing, the annex on wealth sharing, the annex on normalization, and the annex on transitional modalities. Okay. The power sharing, what is the logic or what is the wisdom of having annexes? They put flesh to the principles that are enunciated in the framework agreement about power sharing, wealth sharing, normalization, and transition. So in other words, as I've said, the FAB is the mother document. The more detailed description are the annexes. So they have to go together. So the framework agreement, the annex on power sharing talks about the reserved, the concurrent, and the exclusive powers of the national government, of the Bangsamoro government, and the shared power between the national and the Bangsamoro government. And these are what is written in the framework agreement. For example, national government takes care of foreign affairs, national defense, and security, postal, coinage, fiscal, and monetary policies, and so on. Concurrent, meaning this is the shared power between the national government and the would-be Bangsamoro government, would be audit and administration of justice. And exclusive to Bangsamoro would be education, culture, fisheries, and forestries. Now, this is what is written in the framework agreement. And as I've said, the details of these are still being negotiated by the government panel and the MILF panel. Next slide. The Annex on Wealth Sharing has been approved. Okay, the Annex on Wealth Sharing has been approved. And the basic idea of the Wealth Sharing Annex is for the Bangsamoro government to have fiscal autonomy and sustainable development. Now, students of political science would agree with me that an autonomy without fiscal autonomy, a political autonomy without fiscal autonomy is a farce. And that actually, and therefore, this is what the framework agreement is trying to address. You cannot have a political autonomy. Parang sa mga anak yan, hindi ba? Pag naging independent na yung anak, hindi pwedeng uuwi siya every week para magpalaban ng damit sa nanay niya. Ganon din yung Bangsamoro. You need to also provide the Bangsamoro government the mechanism and the instrument so that they can govern as an autonomous region. And that is what the wealth sharing is all about. So the framework agreement talks about taxation, block grants and subsidies, revenue sharing from natural resources, and creation of consultative mechanisms so that the power arrangement between the national government and the Bangsamoro government is actually laid out. So as I've said, the details of this has already been approved, and it is downloadable actually from the OPAP website. Next slide. Now, I'll go first on the transitional arrangement and modalities. The transitional arrangement and modalities basically contains the roadmap that I have discussed earlier. It also talks about third-party monitoring team. To accompany the process, basically are civil society organizations who will monitor and oversee if indeed the intention of the agreement is actually being achieved. Okay? And the transition arrangement and modalities also talks about when do we say that we have completed the commitments of both parties. In other words, it actually lays down the exit plan. When do we say that we are quits na, parang quits na tayo? We've already done our commitments to each other. Okay? This has been approved. This has already been approved, and the third-party monitoring team has already been constituted. So in other words, incrementally, little by little, we are moving forward. The Annex on Normalization, and this is where I am part of as a technical working group, is still being negotiated. So why normalization? In international language, we call it DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. But the argument of the MILF is that we've never left the communities. Why will you reintegrate us? What we need and what we want is to normalize our situation. From an abnormal situation where you have conflict, we want to go back to a normal situation where you have an absence of armed conflict. That's why the term normalization. But it is really talking about what do we do with the arms of the combatants? How do we break apart the military character of the Liberation Front? And how do we now create a condition where communities and individuals go back to the normal way or peaceful way of life? This is still being negotiated. And I think especially our friends from the military and the police would know that this perhaps is the most challenging annex because we're already talking about arms and organization. Now, moving on, let me now go to the other, next slide please, the other controversial table, okay, the MNLF peace process. Now, next slide please. Ilabas mo lahat, Mick, there. Oh. Basically, the 1976 Tripoli Agreement that was signed by the government and MNLF led by Nur Miswari came to a closure in 1996, okay, when the government signed the final peace agreement with the MNLF. So in other words, it has gone full circle. From 1976, there was a closure document, that's why it's called the Final Peace Agreement, okay, the FPA, in 1996. After the signing of the 1996 Peace Agreement, the government and the MNLF as a partner began implementing the commitments of both parties. Now, if you look at the 1996 Peace Agreement, it is actually, or it can be divided into two phases. Phase 1 talks about, and I'm going to go through the three major components of Phase 1. Phase 1 talks about the integration of 7,500 MNLF members into the AFP and the PNP, and this has already been done. And in fact, I believe that in the Zamboanga siege, some of the MNLF integrees were the ones who helped defend who fought the forces of Malik. Some of them, I believe, also were the casualties. Okay? So this has already been done. Okay? Paki-click meet. So this was completed by 2003. Next component of Phase 1 is what we call the transitory period. Basically, this is the establishment of a transitory mechanism through Executive Order 371. What is being discussed here? The creation of, I think it was mentioned earlier, the SPCPD, the Southern Philippines Council on Peace and Development, the establishment of a special zone for peace and development, and the establishment of a consultative assembly. Again, this has already been done. Okay, this has already been done. And in fact, when SPCPD was created, it was chaired by Nur Miswari, who concurrently acted as ARMM governor. So Miswari was elected on September 9, 1996 as ARMM governor. So he was concurrent governor and SPCPD chair. Now, what is the difference? As governor, you are the political leader. As SPCPD, you are the head of the economic body that is supposed to deliver development in the area. So in other words, two crucial functions, and it was already delivered or it was already done. Okay. Next. Still part of Phase 1, the development initiatives in the special zones of peace and development areas. There was a 4-phase GPH or government and UN multi-donor fund or program called Action for Conflict Transformation or Act for Peace. So this was during 1997 to 2010, and there were the development aid from international community actually happened between this period. After the 1997 to 2010, Pamana came in to take over, in other words, so that there will be no lull in the development interventions on these areas. So when the Act for Peace was finished in 2010, Pamana came in 2011 in the MNLF area, as I've said, to ensure that there is no development vacuum. Okay, next slide. Now, Phase 2 of the implementation is the establishment of a new regional autonomous government. Okay? Now, basically what this phase intends to happen is to amend or repeal Republic Act 6734, which is the basis of the ARMM Organic Act. And also to conduct a plebiscite to determine the establishment of a new government in specific area of autonomy. Again, this has been done. Republic Act 9054 has been passed, repealing RA 6734. Okay, meaning we didn't only amend 6734, we repealed it and we replaced it with a new law. And there was a plebiscite that happened in 2001, okay? There was a plebiscite that happened in 2001. Now, where are we in the implementation? Okay, and this, I believe that because of what happened in Zamboanga, you have heard of the tripartite review. Let me just very quickly talk about the context of the tripartite review. Next slide, please. The tripartite meeting is an offshoot of the OIC resolution that called on the parties, meaning the government and the MNLF, to establish a mechanism to further move the implementation of the 1996 FPA. In other words, the tripartite review is meant to speed up the delivery of the commitments of both parties. Next slide. There were several meetings held, okay, and this is before the Aquino administration. So you have there a list of the meetings that were held, and take note, every time that there's a meeting, you have the government and the MNLF. I think around by this time, you have the two wings of the MNLF already, but they both attend the tripartite review. Okay, they both attend, the Miswari wing and the SEMA wing both attend the tripartite review. So you have here several meetings that basically finalize what we call the 42 consensus points. What are the 42 consensus points? These are the things which, according to the review process, are the weak areas in the implementation of the final peace agreement. Okay. So in other words, they feel that these areas has to be presented as an amendment to the existing ARMM law, so that you strengthen the implementation of the final peace agreement. Okay? And take note, in all these meetings, the government sends USECs and ASECs, not only directors, but very high-level officials in these meetings, because that's how committed the government was in completing this process. Now, during the time of the Aquino administration, next slide, okay? During the time of the Aquino administration, the tripartite review process continued. Okay? So the tripartite review process continued. Again, various informal meetings and experts working groups to prepare for the second ad hoc high-level meeting, which happened in February. Okay? The second ad hoc meeting happened in February February to March of 2012. I will go back to this later on. Okay? But this again, okay, these were done during the time of the Aquino administration. Now, next slide. The proposed the 42 consensus points, okay, because the tripartite review process said they are the weak points and therefore they need to be recommended as amendment to RA 9054. So we put them together. Kinonsolidate po yung 42 consensus points na yan, and then it was drafted as an amendment, okay, to 9054, and it's ready to be submitted to Congress. Ready to be submitted to Congress. When it was presented to Chairman Noor, he objected and he said there are still 3 remaining unresolved issues. Okay? In other words, he didn't agree that the 42 consensus points that has already been drafted into a recommendation or an amendment to the RA 9054 should not be submitted yet, because in his opinion, there are still 3 remaining unresolved issues. Ano po itong tatlong unresolved issues na to? I will talk about the 3 remaining unresolved issues later. Okay? Let me just continue dun sa tripartite review process. Second, apart from the 42 consensus points, the tripartite review process also said the partnership in the ARMM, or there should be a stronger partnership in ARMM in terms of governance reform and development. Okay? And ano po yung ginawa ng government para dito? Okay? The government appointed senior MNLF members in the ARMM government. The government also activated the Joint Peace and Development Monitoring Committee, okay, JPDMC. There was a MOA or Memorandum of Agreement between the ARMM and the MNLF for cooperation in implementation of peace and development programs and projects in MNLF communities. And this MOA was signed by Attorney Parcasio, who is again now very visible in media, and personally witnessed by Nur Miswari. And we also have activated the Regional Commission on Bangsamoro Women to monitor the implementation of PAMANA. Next slide. Other part of the tripartite review is basically the establishment of the Bangsamoro Development Assistance Fund and the establishment of a tripartite implementation monitoring committee. Pakiclick me. The terms of reference actually of these two mechanisms have already been completed. In other words, again, the intention of the review process is to find out how we can speed up the implementation and also to find out the weak points in the implementation. And that's what we have been doing since the time that the tripartite review process has been created until the present. Now, ano po yung sinasabi kaninang tatlong unresolved issues? What were the three unresolved issues that were raised by Chairman Miswari? Una, yung wealth sharing. Okay. He said that there should be a 75-25 arrangement in favor of the MNLF as regards strategic minerals. Now, when they were trying to define the term strategic minerals, unfortunately, they couldn't agree on a common definition. And basically, the MNLF, the two factions of the MNLF, couldn't agree on a common definition of what strategic minerals should be. And therefore, the government proposed an alternative language, and they adopted or they agreed on the alternative language proposed by the government. So this was reflected in the joint statement at the first formal meeting of the ad hoc high-level group that happened in Indonesia in 2011. Second issue of the three that according to Nur Miswari has been unresolved would be the provisional government. Okay. Provisional, ano pong ibig sabihin? What do we mean by provisional government? That the national government appoints officials in the ARMM. Now, the position of the government or the national government is that why are we going to appoint officials if we have been conducting elections ever since? We have established elections and we have been allowing the people to elect leaders, okay, since the 1996 final peace agreement. Why are we going to go back to appointment system? And therefore, and also according to the panel, there was no provision in the 1996 peace agreement about the creation of a provisional government. Okay, so the transition mechanism was done. Ms. Wari actually was supported by the administration during the time of Ramos as the governor, and he won. So he became the governor from 1996 to 2001. And then the succeeding governor is also an MNLF member and also supported again, the candidacy also was supported again by the government. So practically, the MNLF exercised political leadership for a total of 9 years in the ARMM. What is the message that I am conveying here? That it is not true that the government neglected the MNLF, neglected Ms. Wari, because ever since that we have signed the final peace agreement in 1996, processes and mechanisms were put in place, and we made sure that the MNLF leadership are always part of that process. Unfortunately, in some cases, they were the ones who actually who waived their right by saying we are not interested or we do not want to be part of that process. Third unresolved issue, according to Nur Miswari, is the expanded territory through a plebiscite. Now, again, the position of the government is that we had the plebiscite in 2001 while you are still governor. So we cannot have a plebiscite, we cannot have another plebiscite because we already have conducted that. You cannot have, hindi po ba, again, among students of political science, you cannot have a plebiscite every year, okay, to determine the territory. It has already been, it has already been put to test, submitted to the people made the decision. Now, under the framework agreement, okay, now being negotiated with the MILF, there will be a plebiscite again. But this is based on the new agreement, the framework agreement on the Bangsamoro. In other words, under the 1996 final peace agreement, the commitment of the government to have a plebiscite has already been satisfied. Okay, next. Now, how do we move forward? Next slide, please, Mix. Basically, what we wanted or what we would have, what we were proposing is to close or complete the tripartite review process. Again, in the beginning of the Zamboanga standoff, there were a lot of news saying that the government is closing the agreement or completing the agreement with the MNLF. What we were proposing is to close the tripartite review process. You cannot have a never-ending review process, hindi po ba? So that's what we were proposing. But again, that was the proposal of the government. The MNLF also has a counter-proposal. And that should have been decided in the September 16 meeting kung natuloy po yung meeting na yon. So, gano'n naman po lagi sa negotiation. You present a proposal and then the other party presents a counter-proposal. The proposal of the government is to end the tripartite review process. The MNLF has another proposal, but unfortunately, that negotiation never took place because of what happened in Zamboanga. Now, next slide. In terms of how do we bridge what we have with the MNLF with what we are having or what we are negotiating with the MILF. I think a lot of people are also asking that. How do you now link the 1996 final peace agreement with what you are negotiating with the Bangsamoro or with the MILF? Let me emphasize that from the very beginning, the panels, both the government and the MILF, when they started negotiating, they are building on the successes or the achievements of past agreements. In other words, hindi naman po katulad to ni Mayor Atienza at ni Mayor Lim, na pag nagpalit ng you're familiar, well, I'm from Manila, of course, the example that I gave is from Manila, but in some local government units, when a new mayor takes over, he will abrogate all the projects of the previous mayor, especially if they are opponents, di ba? But in this case, the panels, government and the MILF, were both conscious of the achievements of past agreements. So in other words, they were standing on the shoulder of past agreements. And that they are building on the weak areas, okay, of those agreements and trying to strengthen further what can be delivered more, okay, or what can be improved more in the Bangsamoro. So in other words, hindi po iniiwanan yung 1996. In fact, we are building from the 1996. Okay? We are building from the 1996 peace agreement. Ikalawa, how do we, again, physically or operationally link the MN and the MI? In the transition commission that I mentioned earlier, under the MILF process, the transition commission is supposed to convert the framework agreement into a law. That is also our opportunity. Since the 42 consensus points were not submitted to Congress, again, because Nur Miswari also rejected it, that is also the opportunity where you can marry the 42 consensus points and the framework agreement of the MILF. So we said, we offered, again, the government offered, okay, to have MNLF representatives. We invited MNLF, okay? Magbigay kayo ng pangalan, okay? Magbigay kayo ng pangalan, ilalagay namin dun sa section na government nominated. Government nominates 7 members, MILF nominates 8 members. So the government commits that at least one, we will make sure that MNLF is represented here. Now, you can submit more names for us if they are qualified. Then why not? It is an added bonus. Okay? Pero yung one na nire-reserve ng government sa MNLF, kahit na hindi qualified, okay? Kahit na hindi qualified, we will make sure that you have a voice there. Okay? But again, they didn't submit. They forgo that ano bang tawag mo doon? That offer, okay, from the government. Now, there is also an attempt to encourage party building among the members. And take note, when we talk about MNLF, it is not a monolith organization anymore. There are factions. So those the factions that are willing to work with the government, we are working closely with them. So as I've said, there are development interventions through the Pamana, okay, and of late, we have allocated 691 million for the 133 communities with 201 projects located in 13 provinces and 3 chartered cities. So tuloy-tuloy po yung government intervention in terms of development. And also, the Transition Investment Support Plan, or TISP, the government has earmarked 8.5 billion. Okay, I don't know how many zeros is that, okay, but 8.5 billion for the improvement, development of ARMM areas. Now, next slide. Now, I go to the third controversial table. Marami po kaming, this is the third controversial table that we have, the government and the negotiation with the CPP and PANDF. The brief background, okay, insurgency has been a problem for 45 years. NPA was created, the New People's Army was created 1969, Communist Party of the Philippines created 1970. Negotiations have spanned 26 years, 5 panels, 4 presidencies. More than 40 rounds have been completed since 1992. Medyo mahal po itong process na to at napakatagal nitong process na ito. More than 10 agreements and joint statements have already been achieved, but most of these are procedural. Only one substantive agreement has been signed, and that's the one that Colonel De Leon mentioned earlier, the CARIL, the Comprehensive Agreement on Human Rights and International Humanitarian Law. That is the first substantive agreement. Next slide, please. There are 3 other substantive agreements, and this is what they invoke when they say the Hague process, because it was during the Hague round of talks where the 4 substantive agreements were agreed upon. So the first, as I've said, is the CARIL. The second is the Comprehensive Agreement on Socio-Economic Reform, or CASER. The third is the Comprehensive Agreement on Political and Constitutional Reform, or the CAPCR. And finally, the end of hostilities and disposition of forces. Now, what is the character of these agreements? They are sequential. Okay? Or there is a very strong sequential character. Meaning, and again, take note, let me draw your attention to the word comprehensive agreement. Okay? So, comprehensive agreement on human rights and IHL. If both parties are satisfied with the implementation of this comprehensive agreement, then that's the time that they begin talking about the comprehensive agreement on socio-economic reforms. How are we going to achieve a comprehensive agreement? I think that in this room alone, we have different opinions about national industrialization. We have different opinions about agrarian reform. We have different opinions about investment plan and foreign direct investment. In other words, how can 2 parties achieve a comprehensive agreement on socio-economic reform? Sorry, my bias is up here showing. But in other words, how can 5 members from the government and 5 members from the NDF represent the interests and views of 92 million Filipinos. So that's actually one major problem with this, the term comprehensive agreement. And we haven't even talked about the comprehensive agreement on political and constitutional reform. Okay? So only when we are satisfied with the CASER, that's when we move to CAPCR. And only when we are satisfied with the implementation of that, then we move on to the end of hostilities and disposition of forces. In the 26 years that we've been negotiating with the NDF, we only have signed one substantive agenda, and that is the Karil. I admit that there had been, as I've said earlier, about 10 other agreements, but they are more procedural. The substantive are these 4, and so far we only have 1. So if we use this as our benchmark, it took us about 15 years to sign Karil. Okay? It took us 15 years to sign Karil. So ibig sabihin, if that is our average, so we need another 45 years to complete the process. We probably are all retired by then, and I don't think we will, I don't think the next generation will have the stomach to continue this process. All right. Now, in the meantime, that negotiations are going on, there were a lot of CBMs, confidence-building mechanisms in terms of ceasefire, release of prisoners, and so on. Norway has been facilitating the talks since 2001. It has been on and off because of the issue of political prisoners and human rights violation. Next slide. Since the panel has been reconstituted under the Aquino administration, we had 2 rounds of informal talks to reconnect and to revive the peace talks. And a formal sit-down negotiation happened in February of 2011. So it basically ended the 7-year impasse from 2004 to 2011. Ano yung significant dito? Ceasefire. We had an unprecedented ceasefire of 19 days in February, and also ceasefire during the time that we were talking. Okay? During the time that we were talking. And what is the meaning of ceasefire to conflict-affected communities? It means that there is normality in their situation, that they do not fear that there will be landmines, that they will not fear that there will be armed encounter between the government and the NPA because there was ceasefire. Now, where are we now? Next slide. Talks have been stalled since June of 2011. Why? Because the NDF made a precondition of releases, prisoner releases. They said that all, if not most, of the 12 remaining JASIG. JASIG is Joint Agreement on Safety and Immunity Guarantee. It basically talks about that the consultants of both the government and the NDF should be protected. They should not be harmed, they should not be arrested, they should not be imprisoned. So the NDF alleged that some of those that the military and the police have in their custody are actually JASIG. So what the government did is, okay, let's verify. Kasi aliases we don't know actually if indeed the person that you are alleging to be a consultant is covered by JASIG. So we recommended the opening of the safety deposit box where supposedly under the agreement, the names, the pictures, and the aliases are placed in an envelope and put in a safety deposit box. When we opened it, and when we say we, it means NDF representative, government representative, and third party. When it was opened, what's contained is a diskette, an encrypted diskette with supposedly the name, the picture, and the aliases. And there is no diskette that can decrypt the diskette. So there was a failure of verification. And therefore, you are now in a standstill because on the one hand, the NDF demands that their allegedly consultants be released. On the other hand, the government's position is that there was a failure of verification, which is not the fault of the government because it was the NDF who decided to put it in a diskette. So where do we move from there? Okay, so that's why the talks is actually in an impasse. Sige. let's skip that. Let's skip that. Okay, there. The government is open, okay, to releases. Take note, sorry, can you move a bit? I just want to highlight one slide back. No, one slide back. There was a special track offered by the NDF in December of 2012. Okay? There was a special track. It was Joma Season who actually offered it. And when the government looked at the condition, well, look at the proposal, the government said, this looks doable. So in other words, we were very hopeful that maybe this special track that is not within, that does not talk about the four substantive agenda, Karil, Kaser, PCR, and end of hostilities. This special track that is not tied by that four substantive agenda is actually more promising. So the government said, okay, we will come back and then make our counter proposal. Okay, so when the government came back to offer the counter proposal, the NDF withdrew their original proposal and presented a new set, which unfortunately has a semblance to the regular track, okay? Meaning going back to the four substantive agenda again. So sabi ng government, how are we going to do that? You don't want to sit down in the regular track unless releases are done. We are pursuing the special track because we thought that this has more promise. Now you want us to go back again to the regular track where we will be saddled again with the question of releases. Okay? So that's where actually we are. Okay? In the meantime, government is trying to find how to make the agenda of the local, the government is trying to find what we call a time-bound and agenda-based framework so that we can move the process forward. Now, very quickly, CBA and CPLA, this is the breakaway group of the NPAs in the Cordillera, and then there's another breakaway group of the NPA in Negros. Okay, these are the other remaining tables that we have. Now, we've signed a final agreement with the CPLA last July, and we are in the process of, again, DDR, disarming or taking their firearm, providing them employment, and mainstreaming a normalcy in their life. Okay, that's, sige, skip na natin yung, and then let's go to the RPA. In the RPA, basically, we are hoping that the closure agreement will be signed this year. What is the importance of a closure agreement? The closure agreement spells out the commitment of both the government and the other party. Okay? The commitment of the other party or the agenda of the government with regard to the commitment of the other party is always disarmament or arms management, breaking apart the Liberation Army or Liberation Front character of the organization so that we can begin the normalization or going back to a normal and peaceful life. That is the agenda of the government. That's why we are very concerned with a closure document, because while it spells out the commitment of the government in terms of development and employment, it also spells out the commitment of the other party to disarm, to demobilize, and to mainstream themselves in normal civilian life. Now, go to the slide, the challenges, that talks about the challenges. There. Now, the question is, how do we break the cycle of underdevelopment and violence? And this has been laid very comprehensively this morning. Okay? How do you break this cycle? Okay? Where economic activity in communities remain low because investors, local and international, do not want to go in. They are worried to come. Okay? And because there is no economic activity, there is no employment, people are drawn to violent activities, okay? Because this is the easy way or the quick solution to earn a living. How do you break that cycle? Let me just show you, next slide. This is the Human Development Index bottom provinces in 2003, in 2006, and 2009. The highlighted portion are the consistent or the provinces that consistently are in the bottom 10. And what is the common denominator among these consistent provinces? They are all conflict affected. So there's really a very, very strong link between development, okay, quality of life, and violence in communities. Now, again, Gender Development Index on the other hand, okay, same year, 2003, 2006, and 2009. You will find the same provinces. Those that are in the bottom list of HDI also have, or the GDI also have them in their bottom list. Okay? So what are the common provinces here again? Davao Oriental, Maguindanao, Sulu, Agusan Sur, Basilan, Sarangani, Compostela Valley, Masbate. These are all conflict-affected areas. So the quality of life of women in these areas, okay, remain a challenge. Now, just to play again with some figures, okay, this is the presentation of Secretary Deles, which I helped put together. No? That's why I have access to this data. Life expectancy, these are the basis of the Human Development Index. Females outlive the male. But in terms of educational performance, okay, again, the females have a higher educational attainment than the male. But if you look at the completion rate of high school, okay, 32%, 30% for the male. In 2006, 37% for the female. For the male, 34%. The mean year of schooling in 2006 and 2003 and 2006, which I failed to put here, is between 6 to 6.5 mean years of schooling. That means the highest educational attainment that the majority of the people here achieve is elementary education. How do you break that cycle? Okay? How do you break that cycle? The peace negotiation and the peace agreement between the government and the armed group will not solve this problem. And this is where I was coming from when I say that the local government has to come in, because the negotiation can only address a very particular area in the peace process. The bigger area actually has to be addressed by the entire government. Ito pa, look at the economic activity. Despite the slightly higher educational attainment of the females, in terms of income, it is highly skewed still in favor of the male. Almost twice, okay? In 2003, in 2006, and again in 2009. It's been consistent. So, what is the challenge? Okay? Challenges and opportunities for civil society, for the academe, and for the business to become part of the solution. The government cannot and will not provide the entire solution. As I've said earlier, it can only address a particular portion in the peace process. Negotiation only facilitate the vertical conflict between the state and the non-state actors. The civil society must come in. And this is really a very big challenge for the civil society. Join us, accompany us in this process, learn the processes, the mechanism, and capacitate yourselves so that you can really be monitors. Kanina, ipinapasa natin lahat sa Bantay Bayanihan. But in fact, in my opinion, we need to organize ourselves, or civil society organizations must organize yourselves. These are the processes that are involved in the peace process. So when the groups disarm, how do we monitor? Okay? How do we actually monitor the arms management component of a peace agreement? How do we monitor if indeed the MNLF, and take note, they have signed the peace agreement in 1996, but until now they call themselves Liberation Front. How can you be a partner of the government if you still recognize or you still identify yourself as a liberation front? So there has to be a transformation also in the mindsets of these partners, for them to really be partners in development. So there is no, and this is my last slide, there is no clear and clean formula on how to achieve peace. There is no singular solution to end conflict. The important thing is to keep the channels open, dialogue, feedback, recommendations on how to improve the situation. If there are no channels, create channels. Just like what we did with Bantay Bayanihan when I was still with the group. When we saw the IPSP and it talks about multi-stakeholder engagement, sabi namin sa AFP, siseryosohin namin kayo dito. We will create our organization and we will monitor how you implement this IPSP. And we challenge also the other organizations to do the same. Kapag nakita nyo yung peace process with the MNLF, with the MILF, and these are public documents once they are signed. Monitor how they are being implemented, okay? Monitor how they are being implemented. We need to continue imagining and working together for peace, and we need to transform mindsets as well as institutions. So I am very sorry I exceeded my time limit, and I hope that I was able to do justice in terms of providing you with updates. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary Ureta, for a very enlightening presentation. I know that all of you are probably itching to ask your questions of Ms. Ureta. However, before we proceed with the open forum, we still have a couple more speakers. And before that, I would like to call on Professor Haji Balahadja for a few announcements.
For our media partners who wish to interview our speakers later this afternoon, we have an anteroom there available for our media partners. So later this afternoon, after the forum, we will provide you, our media partners, and also those who wish to ask questions for the Tri-Media to proceed to the anteroom for our interview. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Balahadja. Now, before we proceed to our next speaker, earlier this morning I mentioned that we already had around 200 registrants today, and we have more who have come in this afternoon, so I would just like to briefly acknowledge them. So let's all welcome our representative from the Development Academy of the Philippines, or DAP. Good afternoon, ma'am. We also have with us some representatives from the Mindanao State University, MSU. Good afternoon as well. We have with us an NGO, Freedom. Hello, good afternoon, wherever you are. Okay. Thanks for coming. And we have some officials from the Provincial Government of Compostela Valley. Good afternoon, sir. Thanks very much for coming all the way from Comval. And now, moving on, I would like to announce that our next topic will be about post-conflict reconstruction in the Philippines. And who better to talk about that than, no less than, he's an adopted son of Mindanao. He's been here for several years, and he's worked on several projects for this island economy. Let's all welcome, he's a consultant for the World Bank, Dr. Fermin Adriano.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction. Actually, it was thirst. but anyway, it was, Davao is a second home for us because we live here for about 5 years in the 1990s, during the time when Mr. Paul Dominguez was the presidential assistant for Mindanao. And we basically had a lot of technical assistance to what was MEDCO then and the OPAMIN. So it reminded me all of those. And part of my, the younger days of my son were spent in Davao, in Maa, actually. Okay. Anyway, the topic that was given to me, there was a different title, Challenges to Post-Conflict Reconstruction. So I made my presentation based on that. There had been a lot of reintegration, reconstruction effort that had already been, that had been done by the government in the past. This is not something new to the Philippines. And I think a lot of our problems are actually not new. It has been recycled over and over again. If you look at our agricultural development problems, agrarian reform problems, problems with transport, shipping, airports, et cetera, there, and power kind of thing, we tackled that because we were used to address a lot of policy issues related to Mindanao's development. They're still persisting up to this day. And this reintegration thing, as I mentioned, by the way, I just have 9 slides, and I'll try to be short, brief in my presentation. Just a rundown. Can we have the next slide? There was a reintegration done program, reconstruction, in the 1950s by President Magsaysay. It was under the so-called Economic Development Corporation. And I will just mention to you the focus or the highlight or the main component of the reintegration. And the main component of the reintegration is land reform. And part of it was resettlement of Christian, particularly Hawk rebels that surrendered to the government in Mindanao. Okay, so if you'll see some areas here in Sultan Kudarat or something like that, you will see that those were the areas assigned to the Hawks. And that was the main component of the reintegration program. Another one was, again, implemented in the 1980s under the Mrs. Cory Aquino's administration. That's what you call the National Reconciliation and Development Program. That was in 1986. An executive order was issued by the President, Executive Order number 103. And what was the major components? What were the major components? One is the immediate assistance. 2 is the balik baril. You know, you've heard about that. That was the original activity. Balik baril was the, was implemented originally under that reintegration program. And the third component was delivery or extension of economic livelihood assistance to rebel returnees. The third one was the so-called New National Reconciliation and Development Program, which was also implemented under Mrs. Aquino's term, latter part of the term, 1992. We all know that President Ramos started in July 1992, still under President Aquino. And what was the main component of that particular integration program? The main component is basically the Balik Baril program plus the land reform program, targeting particularly the rebel returnees from the CPP-NPA. Okay. Next one, please. Another one, because of the creation of the National Unification Commission and the recommendations coming out from their NUC report, there was another integration program implemented, this time under the Ramos administration, springing from the recommendations of the NUEC, which was headed by renowned Heidi Yorak, the late Heidi Yorak. And what was the major component of that particular integration program? It is, there were 2 components. Aside from the national funding that were given to the rebel returnees, it was complemented by local funding wherein they recognized the important role of local governments in this reintegration process. So hindi lang dun sa national government ang gagaling yung pera, but also the local stakeholders, the LGUs, were tasked to deliver services, particularly economic and social services to the rebel returnees to ensure that it will really reach the rebel returnees. Because if it's national program, it's difficult to monitor. So that's the major difference of that particular integration with the previous ones. The next one, there was also a reintegration program that was implemented under President Estrada's term, and that was the expanded NPUD, or National Program for Unification and Development. the main feature of that, because of the problems with the validation and authentication of rebel returnees, that was the main focus of the reintegration program. They tried to build a validation and authentication system so that they can be sure that these are the real eligible beneficiaries of the assistance that will be given, because the previous ones were attended by a lot of confusion, and therefore, because of the confusion, corruption. And of course, it was accompanied by the usual economic and social services. And the last reintegration program that was undertaken was under the previous administration of President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, which was the SIP, or Social Integration Program, in 2007. And the main component of that, what makes it different from the rest is that, first is that there was still weapons buyback, the balik armal, but it had a component of what they called healing and reconciliation. There was a psychosocial assistance given to the rebel returnees and the communities. That was the major difference of that reintegration program with the previous ones. So who were the combatants covered by those different reintegration programs? Well, it's the HMB who pong mapagpalaya ng bayan in the 50s, some of the rebel returnees coming from the CPP-NPA, the breakaway groups from the RPA, Revolutionary Proletarian Army, Alex Bongkao Bigay, Revolutionary Proletarian Manggagawa, there's an A and there's an M, one in Mindanao, the CPLA, Cordillera People's Liberation Army Rebel Returnees, of course, the MNLF under the 1996 peace agreement, and right now, before that, there were some allegedly MILF rebel returnees. And hopefully, we will be covering a lot of the MILF combatants if the peace agreement and the annexes to the peace agreement, particularly the normalization, will be signed. What are the insights and lessons learned from this different reintegration program? First is that, one, are we there? There was extreme difficulty in targeting assistance to combatants versus the communities. A prime example was the MNLF, the assistance given to the MNLF. In 1996, right after the signing of the final peace agreement, there was a deluge of, supposedly intentions and assistance eventually, from donors and government. Unfortunately, the different entities or institutions could not identify who should be the beneficiaries. In fact, we have a project called SOPAD Social Fund. They didn't know who the beneficiaries are, so they opened the door for all proposals, and we have 3,000 proposals that came in, and we couldn't determine whether they are eligible or not. And it happened with the UN Multi-Donor Act for Peace, and across the board, it happened in the government. But eventually, most of the assistance, and it was a political decision, you have to go, because that's what's the insistence of the Miswari and the other key figures in the movement, that you have to go through the state regional structure of the MNL. Unfortunately, because you went through that structure, there was what we called a lot of elite capture. And there were a lot of complaints that the assistance never reached the intended beneficiaries, the MNLF communities, poor MNLF communities. And that's the reason why they're still complaining about that. But a lot of them, through experiences and documentations, were captured by the state and regional commanders of the MNLF. The second one is there's absence of a genuine disarmament and demobilization. Well, we have the balik armas, but we all know that it's attended with a lot of leakages in terms of what kind of weapons are being surrendered. They're usually the old ones. A lot of complaints about that. When we did a survey of an assessment of the balik baril quietly, we found out that there were a lot of problems, and some of them recycled. So, and this problem is particularly demonstrated, the lack of genuine disarmament, with our experience with the current MNLF. Because there was no disarmament, we were asking President Ramos during the time, He was saying, it's extremely difficult to disarm the Muslim because he was saying during that time that it's part of their culture. But we tried to ask the assistance of the UN because this is an area where there is an expert, security and governance. We asked them to come out with a study, and there was a study commissioned, I think 2003, by a person named Robert Muga, wherein he said we can do disarmament on a gradual scale. Let's target first the high-powered ones, like the RPG, bazooka, etc., etc. Then we can go down. Probably then the rifles, etc., and down the line. Because the RPG and the mines can really kill a lot of people, or regardless of the targets, can kill civilians and combatants at the same time. So we can start with that. Unfortunately, it did not materialize. The recommendations were not implemented by the government. And it's also the same case with the problems what we have with the CPLA. There was no disarmament, RPA-ABB, RPMM. So across the board, there was no real disarmament of these combatants. And that's the reason why there's a proliferation of weapons, there's a proliferation of private armies, and, and gangs and criminal groups because of the lack of that disarmament and demobilization. The third problem that we had was the policy inconsistency within the government on the peace process. We had a peace-building paradigm under the Ramos administration. In fact, he came out with the SRI, Social Reform Agenda, SRA, sorry, which, looking at the structures and institutions, trying to reform them. But eventually, it was reversed by the Estrada administration when he came to power because he declared an all-out war policy in 2000. But unfortunately, his popularity grew, rose immensely when he ordered the assault of the MILF rebel camps. If you look at the survey of SWS and Pulse Asia, it was a major reason for the increase in the popularity of the president. So there was support by the public to that kind of militaristic action against the rebel groups. And probably, I would probably venture to say that the popularity of President Aquino will rise again because of the Zamboanga incident, because of the hardline stance that he adopted. And then after that, after the all-out war in 2001, I was in Malacanang during the time with Ms. Paul Dominguez. So we were able to convince President Arroyo to declare an all-out peace policy. I'm sure you heard about that. We were there in January 23. The revolution was about January 2019 or something like that. Anyway. So she did. Unfortunately, after 2 years, she declared an all-out assault again in Bulyoc. That was in February 2003. So peace, war, peace, and then a ceasefire thereafter, sometime in July. So it's just, this inconsistency, it's giving you the wrong signal, to the public, to the military, and to the donors. What are we really trying to do here? That was the main problem that we encountered because there was no consistency. It's just like you're an investor, you want to invest, but you see this inconsistencies in policies, and therefore it creates a lot of uncertainty. And therefore, if that is the case, if you're investors, you're going to adopt a wait-and-see attitude. And that happened during that time, even among the donors. The next problem that we encountered with this reintegration program is that there was a serious problem with corruption in the reintegration and reconstruction. I think the NPA-CPP propaganda is always saying that it's useless because those money will only be pocketed by LGU officials, national officials. And during the time of Mrs. Annabel Abaya, she came out with the revelation that a substantial portion of the SIP was never spent for SIP. That's in the headline in the newspaper, so that's well documented. So I'm just telling you, citing to you an example of how those money were spent. It was not spent for intended purposes. It was diverted for other uses. So that's the problem. The last one, the fifth problem is that it is extremely difficult to exact accountability from government because there's no single agency mandated to really undertake reintegration, just like what we see in Colombia, you know. There is a specific unit, about 60 of them all over the country, that do just reintegration work. OPAP is in the policy kind of thing, all sorts of kind of thing, but there is no single entity because it's always a multi-agency. DA, you extend livelihood through agriculture. DSW, you extend social services. DepEd, you extend education. DPDS, you extend highways or roads or farm to market road or farm to market road. Farm to market roads. So there is no accountability. And the final analysis, who will ensure that, that these commitments done to the rebel returnees will be delivered to them? There is none. At the end of the day, there is none. You know, whom would you make accountable? There's none. So that's the main problem. The sixth one is the ascendance of the military in reintegration programs. And quite a lot of the rebel returnees, the experiences, for example, in Negros, a lot of them became military assets. So the continuing cycle of violence happened in most of the communities in the CPLA era, etc., etc. So a few more slides, because I want to have a dialogue with you. That's the reason why I'm trying to shorten my presentation. So what are the steps that need to be undertaken? First, that we need a better monitoring evaluation of assistance provided to combatants and conflict-affected communities. That's the reason why this pork barrel scam happened, because we don't have a monitoring evaluation system that was built in by the government. Because everybody says, that's not my job. Di ba? Hindi ko naman trabaho yan, sabi ng senator. Sasabihin naman ng DA, hindi ko naman din trabaho yan, naibigay ko na. Everybody keeps on, because there is nobody doing a real monitoring evaluation system of what's really happening. And in fact, even within the donor community, 15 years after giving assistance to the conflict areas, there is still no robust scientific evaluation, monitoring evaluation that had been established or instituted. So we don't know what works and what do not work. You know, based on solid empirical evidences. The second one is that, but that is being done right now. That's just being done right now by OPAP. There is an attempt, by the way, of OPAP. These are the things that the government is trying to do right now. The second one is that there was a formulation of the national framework for the demobilization of disposition of forces. And under that, it's a template. There is a profiling form that they have to follow, that they have to store, etc., etc. And hopefully they can do biometrics, adopt a biometric technology so that you can really verify. And there will be no double accounting or double crediting of assistance. That's being done. The third one that is being done by the current administration is the implementation of the PAMANA to target the conflict-affected barangays in the country. And this program is also regularly monitored by OPAP. In fact, there was a recent monitoring evaluation study that was done to you. And I'm sure Apple can share all of these documents to you. And of course, lastly, now in the negotiations with the MILF, they are trying to introduce this idea, the annex on normalization, which is basically your reintegration, your DDR. But it's called normalization because of different reasons. You can ask them why. What are the future challenges? Last two slides. The future challenges to reintegration, of course, change in political administration. 2016, after June 2016, we don't know what the policy of that next administration will be vis-a-vis the entire or the whole peace process. Will it be a war again, or we don't know. So that's the biggest uncertainty factor right now. Second, as I already said, there's an absence of a dedicated government agency focused on rehabilitation. This is a full-time job because you have to process the rebel returnees, you have to seek job, you have to train them, job placement, training, etc., etc., you know. As a craftsman, whatever. This is a full-time job, and it will take you about 2 years at least to be able to do it properly based on experiences in Colombia that we saw. Of course, it has to be followed by The next one is that we need to advocate for greater support from the public to the peace process. Because if you go to Luzon, this peace kind of thing only arises when there's a big war like what that happened in Zamboanga. Other than that, it would not register in the radar screen of the public in Manila, or particularly Manila, because they're concerned with traffic rather than the conflict in Mindanao, okay? Especially when there is a downpour. But it's a nasty experience to be trapped in those traffic gridlock. But as it's not, this is true because their consciousness is more geared towards that. And you can just imagine that that's the kind of problem that we also face with Congress, knowing the fact that all of this basic law, this plebiscite and everything will go to Congress for approval. And without solid, strong public support, there's a possibility that it might not be passed, or if it's passed, it might be a watered down version, which is not acceptable to the MILF. I think that's the threat there, if you don't have strong political support for the peace process. Institute security sector reform, I think Apple can talk about this better than me. And the last one is, as I said, all the peace agreement from now on should include disarmament and demobilization. Otherwise, we will have this continuous vicious cycle of violence, perpetuating, permutating in different forms. The last one I just put in, because we were trying to get the public attentions to the conflict. And being political economy, and Mr. Dominguez was a businessman, he was saying, the only way to get the public's attention is to show you the cause of the conflict. Magkano ba yan? If we have a conflict, how much does it cost society, the country? And so we basically contracted the services of a professor from Argentina, Ernesto Barandiaran, and he came out with an estimate using a partial equilibrium process methodology. But unfortunately, because he was just looking at the low level of factor endowments in the conflict areas, he isolated his data on the military expenditures and what's happening directly in the conflict areas. He came out with a very low estimate of $2 to $3 billion for about a 20-year period, which is very low. But then we tried to correct that through the Shabo, Campo, and Judd estimate, and they came out with a more realistic figure, including what we called foregone investment, or investment deflection. That means investment that should have gone to Mindanao and the conflict areas, but did not do so because of the threat of conflict. And they came out with a more realistic figure, about 10 billion. And during that time, using that exchange rate, the conflict would have cost very roughly about 20 billion pesos a year for Mindanao. So in other words, we were having that argument that if you want peace, this is the cause of conflict, it's worth spending 20 billion for peace rather than incurring this cost. You have to look at it from the positive rather than the negative. So that's the kind of argument that we were posing to the legislators during that time. Unfortunately, again, we did not win that battle for some reason. But the thing is that it gives you a rough estimate of how much it costs. Because the total budget, by the way, of ARM, including those outside, which were in, ARM does not directly control because of the lack of what Apple was saying, fiscal autonomy is about 20 billion. So the ARM revenues are coming from direct allotments from the national government. That's the budget of ARM. But there are also resources coming from different sources. One is your pork barrel, from the congressman in ARM. Second is your IRA from your LGUs. That's not controlled by ARM. Then the national government subsidies to ARM, okay? And the fourth one is the internal revenues generated by ARM through taxes, which is only 3% of the total revenues that they generate, okay? So when they said 70-80 or 80-20, it seems so huge, but in actuality it's so small. That's the problem that you have there. So, and that's the reason why we are posing this issue, that fiscal autonomy is important if we're going to have real political economy. I'll stop at that. And then I hope that we can have a better dialogue after the presentation of my colleague Nigel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fermin Adriano. Before we proceed with our next speaker, I'd like to make some more acknowledgments of other people and agencies joining us today. Let's all welcome our representatives from the Mindanao Peace Builders Committee. If you're here, good afternoon. Hello. Please rise to be acknowledged. From the media, we have ABS-CBN. So they're here somewhere. Yeah. Good afternoon. From the Mindanao Times. Okay. And from the National Commission for Muslim Filipinos. I guess over there. Hello, good afternoon. Thanks for coming. The Davao Startup Commission. Anyway, they're here. Okay. We also have guests from the Presidential Management Staff. So, good afternoon, wherever you are. And reps from the Commission on Higher Education, or CHED. So, hello. And from the Daily Mirror, we also have some friends from the media. And TABS. Okay, that's an organization that also registered here today. TABS. Daily Mirror. Oh, done. CIDG 11. We have some reps from the CIDG. Hello, good afternoon. GMA Radio. DXRP. Sunstar. Bombo Radio. Edge Davao. And Charm Radio. So to our friends from the media, good afternoon, and thanks for coming. We also have with us some representatives from the Go Tagum Foundation, I guess all the way from Davao del Norte. Thanks for coming. And St. Mary's College in Tagum from the Academe. And representatives from the local government unit of New Bataan, that's in Compostela Valley Province. And from the Mindanao People's Caucus. And last but not the least, from Ateneo's very own Sama Sikofil. So good afternoon, thanks for coming. So our next speaker is a consultant to the World Bank, where he has held. He is the co-director of the 2010 World Development Report, is a consultant to the World Bank, where he has held several senior positions, including serving as the country director for Nepal, Ethiopia, the West Bank and Gaza, and the Pacific Islands. His consultancy also extends to governments, donors, and NGOs working on issues of conflict. Currently, he is a senior mentor at the UK NGO International Alert and a senior non-resident fellow at the New York University Center on International Cooperation. To talk about international perspectives on the economics of post-conflict reconstruction, let's all welcome Mr. Nigel Robert.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been working hard today. It is really quite hard work to listen to people all day. So I will try to be quite brief and to change the pace a little bit by talking not about Mindanao or the Philippines, but about the world in general. I'm actually going to speak today about the issue of trust. How trust is a casualty of violence and how essential it is to rebuild trust in the aftermath of war as part of any successful peace process, as history and as research will tell you. So let me say a word about this study that I was privileged to manage for the World Bank a couple of years back. We actually looked across the world and over time at around 80 different conflicts. From the post-war recovery of Germany and Japan, right through to the Maoist insurgencies in India today. We included post-colonial liberation movements in Africa, popular revolutions in the former Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, the Arab Spring revolts, Israel's occupation of Palestine, and the American occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as the many drug conflicts that bedevil Central and South America today. In other words, the criminal element of violence. So now what did we find? And how might this be relevant to you in the Philippines, and particularly here in Mindanao? Well, let me take you through a bit of the theoretical logic just quickly, because there is an answer, I think, to what causes violence, what you can do about violence, and how, in very practical terms, successful countries have gone about dealing with this problem. So if I can have the first slide. The first slide shows you something which is called the stress factors that provoke organized violence. This is quite well covered territory academically. Stress factors are of different kinds and categories, and there's also another important division, those that come principally from inside a society and those that are a function of external forces. Now, stress is something we all experience in our own daily lives and at the level of a country. Now, here's an idea I want you to hold in your head. Stress is not something that's purely objective. It's something you interpret and you experience and you react to. In other words, how stress works on you is a psychological process. And this is extremely important because it's the key to any resolution of conflict. It's not done purely by factual or practical activities. It's done by things that appeal to people and that rebuild their trust, that they have faith in and that they believe in. So the psychological dimension of this is absolutely essential. Stress factors alone do not provoke violence. And if they did, then every single country in the world will be violent the whole time. There is a basic difference between countries or areas in countries that are relatively stable and those that are not. If you can go to the next slide. This, in very simple terms, is the difference. And this is what our research showed from looking at these 80 or so conflicts. The dominant difference is that those countries that manage to stabilize, and I say stabilize because every single country in the world is born out of violence and warfare. There are no exceptions to that. What enables and has enabled some countries to stabilize themselves is the strength and the quality and the legitimacy of their national institutions. Now, what do I mean by a national institution? I mean predominantly and most importantly the institutions of the state, but not only the institutions of the state. I mean communal and informal and family institutions, the whole network of institutions that make up a society. Now, why do institutions correlate with peace? The answer is that institutions by their nature are mediating devices. They're ways in which we resolve our problems without killing each other. So where the institutions matter and where people trust them and are prepared to use them, then they do not pick up a gun or a knife or a bazooka and kill each other. I mean, there'll always be some people who do that because for one reason or another they either like doing it or they can get something out of it. But I'm talking about the vast mass of normal human citizens. So, institutions as mediating devices and as the difference between countries that are violent and those that are stable. Let's go to the next slide because we've actually measured this. This is World Bank data. The World Bank has an index which it uses to measure fragility. And this index actually ranks and evaluates the strength of a country's institutions. Now, what this first slide tells you, basically, is that any country that has weak institutions for a period of more than 5 years is almost certain to experience significant organized violence. It's almost 100%. If you have weak institutions in Nepal or Burkina Faso or Egypt or wherever it is, you are going to have a problem. On the other hand, if we go to the next slide, what this shows you is that countries that began with weak institutions but managed to strengthen them over a period of time had a much better than even chance of escaping further episodes of major violence. It's actually statistically a 2/3 chance. So you can see from this just how critical the value of these legitimate institutions is. So the question then, okay, that's all easy enough, but if you're a government that's coming to power in a post-war situation, how do you go about building these legitimate national institutions? It's actually not that easy at all. Well, what we do know are a couple of things, one of which is encouraging and the other of which is not. The encouraging thing that our research showed us is that you can actually focus on 3 kinds of institution. In other words, you don't have to do absolutely everything to stabilize a previously violent situation. What you essentially need to do is to focus on 3 things. The institutions that provide security to ordinary citizens. And what that means in practice is armies and police forces that are accountable to the population and that behave well. The second thing you need are justice institutions. And again, that's a bit broader than simply courts. It means that there need to be ways and mechanisms in society that address people's deepest grievances, the things that make them go crazy and go violent in the first place. There have to be ways of addressing those things. And that's a combination of law courts, alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. There are many forms of institutions that can provide justice. If you just think out of the box a moment, a budget can do that. If a budget changes spending patterns and directs funds to groups that have previously been marginalized, that is a way of restoring justice and dignity to those groups. So it doesn't have to be a law court, but it is a set of institutions that will do enough to give people hope that some sense of justice prevails in this new society. And the third thing are institutions and policies that help people earn better livelihoods. Because in the end, once the security aspects and the justice aspects are taken care of, and those, by the way, are the 2 most important things. I'm an economist, but I'm the first to admit that those other 2 things are more important. But you can't sustain those things unless you have a vibrant economy, unless people have some economic hope, somewhere else to put their energies other than into fighting. There has to be some hope that people can have, that they can support their families, that they have a future that goes beyond the gun. So security, justice, economic opportunity, those are the key institutions. Okay, that's the good news. The bad news is that building legitimate institutions takes a very long time. We measured this when we did this study. You're lucky if you can build a legitimate institution of any description in under 20 years. So here's the problem for a new government coming to power. Most commonly, after 15, 20, 30, 40 years of violence, the institutional landscape is flat. There is nothing much out there that works. There's certainly very little that people trust. And quite often, you will have a new set of actors coming into power who have very little experience of government and very little functional capacity. I don't mean they're not smart. I don't mean they can't do all kinds of things, but they don't have the experience of running governments. So they do not have the capacity that they need. And again, that does not come quickly. So what do you do? So we went to the historical record. We said, okay, let's look at some countries that really clearly succeeded in making this transition away from chaos towards much greater stability. Let's look, for example, at Singapore in the early 1960s, or Indonesia in the late 1990s, Liberia over the last 8 to 10 years, and even my own Northern Ireland in the last 5 to 10 years. Now, what did they do? Is there some common pattern? Is there something that we can learn from when we look at those experiences? Well, we think there is. I think there is, and I think, at least in principle, it's quite a simple formula. Here's what they did. First of all, if we can go to the next slide. First of all, what you had in all these successful examples was good leadership. Now, that's something that's very hard to define, and of itself doesn't mean that much. But what specifically this leadership did was it built broad coalitions of interest. And that can operate at many levels. It can operate at a political party level. It can operate through negotiations. It can operate in a planning context. It can operate in giving a mandate to the armed forces. It can operate in many different ways. But the key is that the leadership, whatever it looked like, was sufficiently compelling and had a sufficiently good story about the future to tell people that most people fell in behind the vision. I say most people. I use the phrase inclusive enough coalitions, because almost always there will be people out there that don't want to have anything to do with the new dispensation. Either they have too much invested in the old way of doing things, or they're just plain bent and corrupt, or they cannot adjust. And at some point, tough decisions need to be made about how much effort one wants to spend on people that are, small in numbers, making a lot of noise, killing people, and doing nothing constructive. Now, and in the end, many of those solutions are going to be quite hard-nosed. Every effort has to be made to bring people in, but at some point that effort has to end, and the majority, the interests of the majority and the interests of progress have to be respected. So the first thing that happened in these countries was this process of pulling together these coalitions. The second thing, this is very important as well as being in a certain sense quite simple, was that leadership then took the trouble to find out exactly what it was that was disturbing people most of all. Why was it that this society had broken down and violence had been perpetrated? Now, the answer almost always is that there is a strong perception of injustice. Sometimes that perception is not accurate, but that doesn't matter if it's strongly held, because the psychology of this is that you believe in what you believe in. So the perception and the reality of injustice has to be understood. That's usually what these leaders and these leaderships and these collectives did by instinct. They usually figured out, if we're going to move beyond where we are now, we have to get our hands on the 2 or 3 things that are most volatile and most dangerous in this situation, and we have to do something about them. In the kind of planning exercises that I'm familiar with, and that many of you are familiar with, that absolutely critical stage is usually not done. Planning is often done on the basis of, well, here we have a nice place, it's got lots of resources, how can we get the private sector in, how can we do education, we need this, we need this, we need this. And as soon as, almost before you've started, you've got a shopping list of things you cannot possibly deliver, given the capacity you have, and given the time window that's available before people start to get very impatient. And you're also doing a number of things that frankly are not relevant to the issue at hand, which is stabilization and the restoration of trust. So in these places, they figured this out. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Northern Ireland, sectarian conflict. You had a very abusive police force, out of which had been generated sectarian paramilitaries. What was the solution there? The solution was to bring the Catholics and the Protestants together and take this Protestant police force and force it to be a cross-communal police force. It's now in areas of the force approaching 50-50. Absolutely revolutionary in Northern Ireland. And a couple of things here. Very difficult to do, took real guts, started with violence. The first Catholic recruiter was murdered. So almost by definition, the things that get at the real problems are going to be difficult, and therefore you cannot take on more than 2 or 3 of them at a time. But here's the good news. If you manage to select the 2 or 3 things that really matter, that's often enough. That will turn the story, and people will think, this government's actually different. Maybe I should suspend my disbelief and give them a chance. So what was happening here was not the creation of large institutions and huge exercises to create a new Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Education. It's discrete activities that create trust that over time, when they're repeated again and again and again over the years, do actually create the institutions that people will come to trust and rely on over time. This is how you buy time in order to bridge that 20-year gap between today and the time when your institutions are really mature and really legitimate. A couple of other examples of this. Liberia. What was one of the most burning issues there? Well, apart from the human rights violations, 20 years of utterly corrupt government. Nobody for a moment believed this new government, which had many of the same faces in it, would be any more honest than any of the others. So why trust these guys? They're just here to loot the treasury, steal all the aid money, and do what everybody else did. The only thing that's stopping them being as bad as the others is that there's a credible UN presence doing the peacekeeping. So what did they do? They said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're not going to manage our own economy. We're not going to authorize our own spending. For every spending authorization we commit to, we are going to have a donor co-signing that. We are going to give up our sovereignty because we understand how important it is to convince our population that these things are being done cleanly. Again, that's a very tough decision to take, but it worked. It worked. That really sent a powerful signal. Give you another one from the security sphere. Burundi, post-genocide, 1990s. You have 2 ethnic groups. You have a majority Hutu group and a minority Tutsi group. The Tutsis basically get massacred rather frequently, both there and in Rwanda. You had a negotiated peace settlement. The Hutu majority comes to power. The Tutsis are extremely frightened. What is going to happen to them? Is this going to be some sort of international sanction of a process that once again will result in genocide? The new government does something very smart indeed. They appoint as the head of their army a Tutsi general, somebody who has been in opposition and fighting against them. They put him in charge of the army, and his staff around him are Tutsis. The army is Hutu. Just think of the signal that sends to everybody. That's of great comfort to the Tutsi population. They can see pretty much immediately that army is not going to go and massacre them. So these kinds of signals of intent, 2 or 3 of them, powerful, difficult signals, they are enough to start to change the narrative and start to recreate trust. A third thing in that column is something called commitment mechanisms, and this is just another sort of lock, or another key in the lock, to try and convince people that change is for real and change matters. Quite often, commitment mechanisms tend to involve third parties in providing one kind of guarantee or another that what a government says it will do, it will actually do. So those commitment mechanisms include things like this Liberian example I mentioned. It includes something I've been working on recently, the employment of an international auditor in Somalia, that auditor being empowered to continually disclose the financial books of the government to the public, including any and all abuses that they find. It includes things like peacekeeping deployments. It includes third-party monitoring mechanisms. So I'm going to stop here, but I'm just going to pull us back for a moment. I said I'm not the one to speak about the Philippines or about Muslim Mindanao or the Bangsamoro. But I just want you to understand how this model actually is very practical and can be applied to something like, for example, the Bangsamoro Development Plan. Let me just tell you what I mean here. How would you apply these principles to that very important piece of planning? Well, here are some ideas. First of all, you put together the broadest possible coalition to write that plan, including people that you would sort of perhaps not want to have involved in it, if you had your own way about this. But you make it as broad as you can, both at the regional level and at the local level. Second, how do you actually determine among all the vast number of needs, and given that there's limited capacity, how do you decide what to do? Well, again, I think there's the answer here. Do a piece of simple analysis, and you do it by talking to people, and figure out what are the 2 or 3 things that most enrage people here. How can you take away the narrative from the revolutionaries and appropriate it to the government? How can you steal the story? That means knowing what the 2 or 3 things are that matter most. Now, I can't tell you what they were. Are they human rights abuse? Are they land issues? Are they corruption? You know these things, and you will be able to get them out of a sensible conversation which is broad-based and goes across society. So you have this board group, you have a few ideas of what matters most. And then I think you focus on how these 3 sets of institutions can address those problems. That is, the security institutions, the justice institutions, and measures that will help improve livelihoods. A couple of things that have worked very well and that I think are worth putting in the mix in such a plan are community-based development programs. You have a national community-driven development program that's being rolled out. That's a very useful tool. Doesn't do everything, but it's certainly helpful. Something that is really worth focusing on is how you create improved livelihoods and more jobs. You have to do that by stimulating investment. The private sector is going to deliver jobs and wealth in the end. The government can open the door, but the private sector has to go through it. Now, what that means in an environment like this is actually quite a lot. First of all, it means providing security. Second, it means sharing the perceived risk. And that means various forms of credit and other kind of guarantees, subsidies, of a very proactive nature by a government in the early stages. So the economic model here that I would advocate is not a sort of free market model. Conflict breaks markets to pieces. They don't function properly anymore. And until they do, you need to rebuild them. And that, in my view, is the role of the government in these kinds of situations. A word finally on ex-combatants, and particularly young men. In many societies, they remain a running sore and a potential pool of recruitment for those that want to make trouble later on down the line. Now, how do you take them out of the violence marketplace and put them somewhere else? They need work, but it's not just work. It's not just a question of these guys going back to their family farms and becoming manual laborers again. As anybody who's worked in any kind of militarized organization knows, the identity that one assumes and that organization gives you is absolutely important. It becomes you, and you become part of it. And that is true for an armed group as it is for a police force or an army. The challenge is to replace that powerful form of identity with something in the civilian sphere that can provide at least a reasonable equivalent. Now, doing that is tough. It's not just giving someone a job. It requires counseling. It requires community mentoring. It requires training and then placing people that have been trained in jobs that give them some prospect of advancement. Again, that doesn't happen by letting the market work itself out automatically. It happens by distorting the market. And that's what you need to do, in my view, to deal with people who have been fighting against the government and fighting authority. You have to give them a leg up. This is repellent to many people because you're saying you're rewarding people that have been violent by privileging them after the peace and giving them an economic handshake that they never deserved. But this isn't about that. This is about what is going to make a country stable. It's whatever works. As Deng Xiaoping would say, whatever the color of the cat, as long as it catches the mouse. The other two things I would say is that in doing a plan of this kind, ask people that have done it before. That's not people like me. That's not the donors. That's people in countries that have come out of conflict, who have worked as advocates, as government members, as planners, who've been through the process themselves and know how it works and know how to do the political trade-offs. There are plenty of those people around the world now. They're the real resource in these situations. And the final thing, beware of the donors. The donors are a curse in an environment like this. If you do not control them, they will control you and they will ruin your process. You absolutely have to control them, and that is the role of the central government. And that means saying no. Not just thank you very much, what a great idea. It's saying no. Actually, we know what we want. We know what we want you to do, and we know what we don't want you to do. It's not easy, but it's absolutely essential. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nigel Robert. Now going down to the home stretch, we'll move on to the open forum, wherein we will request the last three speakers to please come on stage for an open forum. So if I may request Secretary Ureta and Dr. Adriano and Mr. Robert, if you could all come up here to the table. And to moderate our open forum, may I call on Ms. Kathleen Tolosa of the Bantay Bayanihan.
So thank you once again to our three speakers. Indeed, very insightful and thought-provoking inputs. I am looking forward to continuing the dialogue, the discussion that we had this morning. So to accommodate more questions, no, let's do this in sets of three. So let's entertain three questions first, and then we ask our speakers to respond. Again, as Haji said earlier, please let's keep our questions, our responses as short and sweet as possible. And please don't forget to mention your name and the institution you're representing. Okay, so who wants to take, okay, I see a hand there. 1, 2, and the third, okay. Kindly use the mic in the middle. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Rayjan Sauping from Holy Cross of Davao College. I just want to ask the speaker about the discussion a while ago, the Bangsamoro framework. This is my first question. In the implementation or before implementing the framework agreement or the Bangsamoro framework, is there a tendency that there will be going certain amendments to the Constitution to insert the call of the Bangsamoro stated in the framework? And if yes, this is an opinionated answer. Do you think in amending the Constitution to include the Bangsamoro will not create tension or might end into constitutional destabilization on the following grounds? First, it is a special treatment to the minority. I'm referring to the Bangsamoro, which might cause a call for this another or other regionals or regional areas that it should not only the Bangsamoro will be given a special autonomy. And second ground is that MNLF is not a party to the framework, and we all know that MNLF is fighting against the framework of the Bangsamoro because they want an independent or the more independent state or separated from the Philippines. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, and for our second question. Yes.
Hello. Good mayong hapon. I'm Jeremy Simons from the Mindanao Peace Building Institute. And I just had a question about the transition in terms of the judicial process or the restoration of communities. I think in situations where there's widespread breakdown in law and order, people assume that the transition process, the end point or the result of that is simply a return to a very narrow legal process. And I think for those of us in peace building, we see so many different kinds of activities within the peace building arena that contribute to dialogue and to addressing people's grievances, which is the heart of a justice process, addressing the grievances. So it seems there's sort of conceptually this process of shifting our mindset from an outcome that is not just simply result in a very narrow, legalistic, which is oftentimes a more Western kind of result in terms of addressing the justice questions. So I'm wondering if you can say more about what that might look like in Mindanao, since we have so many resources at the community level of traditional courts, alternative processes, how we can still hold on to that in the transition process, especially when much of it is being carried by lawyers who, nothing against lawyers, but the mindset is really more legalistic So how do we broaden that so that our end result is a more holistic justice process, not just a legalistic justice process? I hope that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. And for our last question for this set.
Good afternoon, sir. This question is addressed to Sir Nigel, and I am Michelle J. Nantes from this institution, a student from this institution. So my question is, how can we rebuild confidence and trust without necessarily compromising our interest or your interest, or is that possible?
Okay, so those are the first batch of questions. Judging from the notes being scribbled by our speakers here, I believe we can look forward to more thought-provoking and insightful answers. So who would like to take the first shot? Thank you.
I'll answer first. My answer is short. Will the framework agreement require a change or amendment to the Constitution? The marching order of the President is very clear. We work within the framework of the Constitution and due process. So there is no imagination at the moment regarding amending the Constitution because of the framework agreement.
I think if you're looking at from the perspective of the Bangsamoro, the reason for the drive towards institutionalizing it through the basic law is that they want to avoid the mistakes created, by the MNLF, or they're seeing the experience of the MNLF. They learn from it. In other words, they had this deal with President Ramos, and everything was turned down 180 degrees, changed by the next administration did not comply. So if you're thinking like a Bangsamoro, you would like a certain institutionalization of agreement, and therefore you need a basic law that will really govern regardless of the political administration that will come in. Diba? Ganun. So from their thinking, which is, I think, just fair, isn't it? Because of the experience with the MNLF. That's one thing. The second thing is that I don't know what kind of basic law, the provisions of the basic law. I'm sure that they're realistic enough. I'm not a Bangsamoro, but I'm just looking at it from the political economy perspective. I'm sure that they are, clever enough to realize that they need to address the concerns of their Tausug brothers and that kind of thing. There is a realization on their part. So it will really depend on them what kind of play that they're going to do with the basic law. The second one on transition, I think I like the point of my colleagues here that you have to, what is justice? It cannot be, foremost determined by us. Or you have to ask the community what do you mean by injustice, the perception of injustice. And we start from there. Because we've done a lot of planning, I've been involved in three or something major plannings for Mindanao. And we never ask that question, what makes people angry? What is the perception of, because conflict is a perception of injustice, real or unreal. We have not asked that question. Ano ba? Bakit kayo galit? Ano ba? And then address that. Okay?
Thank you.
I was asked a question about trust. I wonder if the person who asked the question could restate it, because I'm not sure I fully understood, what the exact point was.
So my question again, sir, is how can you rebuild confidence and trust without necessarily compromising your interest?
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, I mean, there are always going to be a variety of competing interests in any situation of this kind. I'm not suggesting that in a peace process you eliminate conflict. What you hope to do is eliminate violent conflict and put it into a different environment where people can argue and fight, but without actually coming to blows. So I think any question of rebuilding trust is going to be a compromise, because what you'll be doing is you will hopefully be satisfying the interests of enough people to help with the general stabilization of society. I think it's a fantasy to think that one can satisfy everybody's interests. The way that any democracy or any kind of consensus process works is that you satisfy enough people's interests enough that you keep them in the game. And that's really all you can ever hope to do. So it's a crude process at best, as is any government and any societal process. There's always going to be dissent. There's always going to be people that are unhappy. But what you hope to do is have few enough people who are sufficiently happy, or at least insufficiently unhappy, that the whole thing doesn't fall apart.
A rejoinder?
Just on the issue of justice, I forgot to mention. In the annex on normalization, there is a whole section that talks about transitional justice. And both MILF and the government are proposing mechanisms on how to go about it. While the mechanisms are not yet agreed upon, be assured that there will be a section on transitional justice. And I believe that we are of the same mind with the MILF to propose a sort of like a study group so that the parameters of the transitional justice will also be based on what the people actually expect in terms of this mechanism. So in other words, it will not be an imposed idea, but rather a study group will be created so that the parameters of the mechanism will be developed.
Thank you very much. We can now have our second set of questions. One, first question, second question, third question. Okay. And it looks like we're going to have a couple more sets of questions.
I am Bob Ginoo. I represent Davao JC Senate, JCs. And this is my question. We have been concerned about NDF, MILF, and MNLF, communism and interests of Muslims. But at this point in time, we still have not considered what the Christians in Mindanao would like. So my question would be, since there are sectors in Mindanao that has varied interest, we would like probably to propose that government should look into the aspect of making Mindanao a federal system form of government. In that way, we will be able to address each sector's concern by having their own federal form of government.
Thank you for our second question.
Good afternoon. I'm Vine DG of Good Wednesday Group and writer for Mindanao News Star. To our panelists, especially the representative from OPAP, I would like to ask on the issue or the demand of the Bangsamoro for autonomy and independence. I believe that it is patterned from other countries, especially the Muslim countries. And in fact, the representatives of the GPH Peace Panel went to other countries, Spain for one, just to see the applicability and the possibility of their setup there that can be applied in our country. I'd like to know I have two questions. May we know the insights that you have learned so far from those educational tours, and what are the applicability here? And the other question is, what's the difference between the Muslim search for autonomy and independence to that of the Cordillera that makes it not possible or not easy on the case of the Bangsamoro? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last question for this set.
Good afternoon. I'm Jojo Reynaldo from the Mindanao Development Authority. I used to work with Mr. Adriano before and also with the OPAP. My question is this. There is this perception or opinion from some quarters that as soon as you finish a peace treaty with a group, another one arises with essentially the same demands. How would you address that, or is that perception valid?
Thank you very much. Who would like to answer first?
Answer the federal.
Okay.
You know, this federal issue was a favorite topic of my good friend Ray Tevez. We had that with June Mercado, Father June. There are pros and cons of it. If you open Mindanao, you'll open the entire country for federalism. Of course, the main strength of it is really, well, supposedly you will give the local officials the power, the authority to provide services since they are now more knowledgeable. Supposedly, this is a theory. They are more knowledgeable of the needs of their people. They will be more responsive. But the long years of decentralization showed us more negatives than positives. If you look at the LGUs in the country, that's one. The second problem that we're going to face is the problem of, it will intensify the problem of ascendant political family or warlords. You know, you will never be able, no one will be able to, probably might be good because there will be policy consistency. It will be difficult to win in many places ruled by a dominant family. And practically, they will be lording the entire political systems, you know, eternally. That's the part. The third issue is related to how are you going to divide the resources? Is Metro Manila and Southern Tagalog, Central Luzon, where it produces about almost 2/3 of the GDP, willing to part or share the resources to a poor area like Caraga or ARM, if you are the taxpayers from there? That's a major problem because I was telling them, you need to come out with an economic and financial analysis to go with your political analysis. Because it's easy to divide the country into several parts, but it cannot stand because it doesn't have the money. A lot of them could not stand because they don't have the money. You know, Southern Tagalog, Central Luzon, Metro Manila, that would be a boon because they have 2/3 of the resources of the country. Okay, how do you convince the taxpayers there? Like Makati, of course, Pateros is very poor. Why doesn't Makati share the resources to Pateros? In the same way, why should Central Luzon, Southern Tagalog, and Metro Manila share the resources to Mindanao? You raise your own resources. You raise your own taxes. That's an issue that's going to be addressed. You know, it's a major issue because you're talking about resources. So you have to figure it out first. We need a lot of dialogues and conversation because political ideas there are fine. But the problem is that it's not accompanied by hard-nosed financial and economic analysis.
The Bangsamoro the agenda of the Bangsamoro is no longer independence. It's really more autonomy, and that has been the spirit of the 1996, the Tripoli, the 1996 final peace agreement, and also the framework agreement of the Bangsamoro. So it is no longer an independent secessionist, but it is really the political autonomy for the Bangsamoro. Now, what they have envisioned and what is written in the framework agreement is a ministerial form of government where they will have a chief minister. So it is really very much akin to a parliamentary system of government. So in other words, while they are part of while they are still part of the Philippines, the political organization or the political system might differ from the central government. But it is again the details of how the ministerial form of government will be organized is still being negotiated in the power sharing annex. Now, what is the difference between the Bangsamoro political autonomy and the Cordillera political autonomy? I didn't dwell so much on the Cordillera People's Liberation Army, but the fact that the CBA-CPLA has already signed a peace agreement with the government, they have not given up on the political autonomy, but the fundamental difference is the unity of the people. In the Cordilleras, the ethno-national affiliation of the different groups, the Kalingas, the Ifugaos, the Kankanes, are actually the main impediment for a united Cordillera. Unlike, for example, in the Bangsamoro, while on the one hand you can argue that it's still a tri-people group, there is more unity in terms of the political autonomy as compared, for example, with the peoples in the Cordillera.
Okay, thank you. So, Ms. Deng, can we hear your question? Okay. We still have a response from...
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And it's very common. And in fact, this is the cause of the breakdown of some of these agreements. If you're lucky, the splinter groups are going to be marginal and relatively ineffective. So, for example, Northern Ireland today, where you have breakaway factions of the IRA that have actually engaged in bombing and assassination, but not at a level that has managed to disrupt the process, and certainly not in a way that has engaged any public sympathy. So if the foundation of the agreement in popular terms is strong enough, if it appeals to enough of those groups that matter politically, then these splinter groups are going to get isolated. They will cause trouble, no doubt. But where trouble is converted into breakdown, it's usually a function of the agreement not being broad-based enough and not including in its benefits enough of those people that really matter. That, for example, was the case in Liberia. The Liberian government of Ellen Sirleaf Johnson that we look at today was actually the 16th attempt over a period of 20 years to form a coalition. That was the one that stuck, but the process broke down 15 times before that.
The addition to federal system and the issue of independence to Bangsamoro, if you do your economics again, it's extremely difficult to have an independent Bangsamoro because the arm right now only produces 5% of the gross domestic product of the entire Mindanao. It's minuscule. It's the lowest. Secondly, if you look at the trade transaction flows, the markets where the products where you bring, where the markets of those products are, they lie outside arm. They go to Cotabato City, that's the processing and marketing center. They go to Zamboanga, processing and marketing center. So how can you imagine an independent entity from it, just from just working on your economics? So it's extremely difficult. If you talk about potential resources, those potential resources will be realized probably 10 to 15 years from now. So don't count your eggs, your chicks before they're hatched. So doing your economics alone will tell you it's not feasible, it's not sustainable. And I think they're smart enough to recognize that, the present leadership.
Okay, thank you. For our next batch of questions.
Good afternoon. I'm Dengue Giento of CRS, not the civil relations sector, but Catholic Relief Services. For me, security means people know how to manage their conflict. They know they're different. They can be in one place, but they know how to manage their conflict. I have been listening to the presentations, especially on the normalization and the DDR, and I've been missing a piece. Been missing the piece of preparing the community or the organization like the military and the police to receive the integris. And I'm wondering if this has actually happened. Dr. Adriano, you listed a lot of integration processes from EDCOR to GMA, and I'm asking whether part of it really was just preparing the integris, or were there really serious attempts to also prepare the communities to receive them? And Dr. ASEC Apple, my question is PAMANA doing the community preparation? And sorry, I just have to do. And for Mr. Robert, you mentioned something about community mentoring. Is this what the face of community mentoring? Is that the preparation for the community to be ready to receive the integris? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our second question.
Good afternoon. My name is Ustaz Jan Arbalo from Masapis Council of Davao and a partner of Alcala. My questions will address to ASEC. Ma'am, you mentioned in your presentation the figure of 600 million for the PAMANA project for this 2013. Is that correct? My question is this enough to cover the arm plus outside arm? And how would the OPAP implement this 600 million to practically influence, or at least it could be filled by the conflict affected communities? Thank you.
Thank you. Our third question, please.
This is for ASEC. Sir. Ma'am. When Henry Kissinger went to China, he immediately identified China as an ideologue. There's a big difference.
Who did identify China as an ideologue?
Because he was supposed to be negotiate with China.
Sino?
Si Henry Kissinger, sir.
Yan.
Henry Kissinger. That was way back then. Sa atin kasi, matagal na nating we've been negotiating with the CPP and PNDF for 26 years, and it lasted for the 4 presidents. Have we really identified the CPP and PNDF as ideologues or pragmatists? Because according to Henry Kissinger, ideologues cannot be negotiated with. Pragmatists can be negotiated, but sometimes he said, you should beware, because ideologues can pose as pragmatists. Now, as to the CPP and PNDF, according to Luis Salandoni himself, they view the peace process as another form of struggle to them. So why is it that we are still negotiating if we know that the 4 agreements will never be achieved? The 4 framework of agreements will never be achieved, although we have had one, the Karil, but the design of the 4 framework would never be achieved because of it is sequential, and it cannot be done simultaneously. So what should be done? My question is, do we see any end in view? Are we going to change the framework? Or it seems to us that we are the ones kneeling down to the CPP and PNDF that we want peace. Baka kailangan baliktarin natin yung point of view na they need peace. We have peace. We have the commodity of peace, and they need peace. Why not treat peace as a commodity that we have, and they're the ones who wanted it? Para po kasi nagmamakaawa. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we have the responses now, please?
Okay. Are we preparing the communities and the host institutions to receive the former rebels or the outcome of the agreement? Is PAMANA doing it? PAMANA is a development intervention of the government and the mechanism or the strategy to forge strategic partnerships with the different government institutions. In terms of preparing the communities, it is not really the PAMANA program, but another program in OPAP that is doing that. We call it the Conflict Sensitivity and Peace Promoting Program. And very recently, we've created a unit under my supervision, the DDR unit, which basically intends to, number one, mainstream the language of DDR among government agencies. And why do we want and why do we need to mainstream the language and the concepts and the ideas of DDR among government agencies? Because we know that once the agreement has been signed, we really need to lock in the different, especially the relevant government agencies, for them to recast, review their program, and determine if it is indeed relevant in these particular communities. In other words, the theme really is that it cannot be business as usual in conflict-affected communities. So those two programs of OPAP are attempting, in partnership with local government units and in partnership with national government agencies, these two programs of OPAP are attempting to do just that. But as I've said, as I have earlier presented, it can only do so much. It really is capitalizing on partnership. Remember that OPAP is a creation of an executive order, and our mandate really is policy formulation and policy oversight. It is really not an operations unit, and therefore we are really stretching the capacity of OPAP in doing all these things. But we also know that if we won't do it, then we are not sure if other government agencies will be doing it. 600 million, is it enough? No. In fact, the budget for the PAMANA has now been downloaded to the different government agencies. So you will not find it anymore under the budget of OPAP, but you will find it under the DILG, you will find it under the DSWD, you will find it under the DAR, the DA. So in other words, the different agencies are now implementing development interventions in conflict-affected areas. But this 600 million that I've mentioned is especially earmarked for ARMM alone. For ARMM alone. And this is over and above the interventions of the other agencies. Okay? But again, the question, is it enough, is always relative. It is like a moving target. When do you say it is enough? Okay? Especially given the reality that you really need to jumpstart development in the ARMM. CPP and PA, are they still ideologues? We will probably spend so many hours to determine whether or not they are just a band of criminals kidnapped for ransom, or are they still a group of ideologues who are still trying to wage a communist revolution. But the point here, why are we still negotiating with them? Because that is the role of the state. The role of the state is always to extend the hand to groups that are not very happy with the way, the state is performing. You cannot just tell this group that you don't like how we operate things, then we will fight you. It doesn't work that way. The function of the state is always to reach out. Now, tayo ba ay nagmamakaawa? I don't think so. While we are on an impasse with the negotiation, in our negotiation, we continue to function and we continue to do a lot of interagency networking and meetings so that we lock in development, governance, security interventions, especially in conflict-affected areas.
The first point, have we prepared combatants to return communities? It depends on the rebel movement that you're talking about, because when you talk about the CPP and PA, there are some communities that there's so much dislike on them because of the criminal extortionary activities. Some of them do not want to return to our colleagues in the army are laughing, but it's true. That's the kind of the feedback that we were getting, that, you know, some of them, they do not want to go back to their communities for fear of their life because they've done oppressive, exploitative, whatever, to their people in the community. It depends on the second one is that because of the policy inconsistency, you have not sustained efforts on reintegration. Third is that, as Apple said here, is that there is no dedicated unit in government that just work on reintegration. It's a full-time job. You know, as Apple said, Secretary Yasek Apple said, this is just one of the things that they have to do because they feel this is important. But it's obvious that they cannot do it because they're not an operations agency, okay? There has to be an agency that has to be doing that like that. In the same way that we're saying that you need a reconstruction czar because, like, for example, now what happened in Zamboanga, you know, you will have a lot of agencies again being coordinated by the president who has a lot of things to do. Somebody has to be on top of that. That's what we're saying. We need a commission just to focus on reconstruction, reintegration. And that guy will report to the president, you know, eat, sleep, talk, reconstruction, reintegration, create the necessary systems and mechanisms. That's one thing that we need to be done, that needs to be done. The second is that they talk about the NPA. You know, in economics, we already talk about incentives. We can change behavior of individuals based on the amount of incentives that we give them. The problem right now is like this. I'm just a practical. If the government assistance program or the package of assistance program cannot match the resources being generated by these groups through drugs or extortionary activities, then we have a problem talking to them, di ba? Kasi yung assistance mo is, the amount of assistance that you can give is not attractive enough to them, di ba? Because they can get probably more revolutionary taxes from mining companies. Then why should we talk to you? They will say, you know, it's a small amount of money. So you have to have some thinking, and you have to have differentiated approach depending on the areas where the rebels are operating. If it's too rich in natural resources, most likely you will never be able to forge peace with them because they will just insist on engaging in their criminal, extortionary, drug-related activities. Then there's no point of talking peace. But in areas where their, you know, resource generation, revenue generation capability is small because of the nature of the community, etc., then probably there's a possibility of talking peace. But I agree with you. It's beyond OPAP. There has to be a clear signal from the president on this. It's not OPAP. It's the president. For me, you know, having been looking at this thing, there has to be a clear signal saying that, okay, in areas like this, we need to go really hard against these guys because there's no way. They're just using the peace process, an instrument to pull our leg. In other areas, we can talk to them because that's the function of the president, really to forge peace. But there's no possibility of having peace with these guys because they're raking in millions and millions of pesos from their extortionarity, critical criminal activities, using the ideology as a front. You know that. Ganun lang yun, di ba? Yun lang aking position. It's controversial, but that's my personal position, by the way. Nagpaalam na ako kay Apple na it's a controversial one. Sorry.
I was asked a question about mentoring. I think this is a very important part of reintegrating former combatants into society. If you look at the best programs that have taken place in the world, they actually come from Latin America, from both Brazil and from Colombia. And there, the problem they're dealing with are criminal gangs and drugs. But many of the issues are similar. And what has worked there are quite complicated, integrated programs that involve better policing, counseling services, communities mentoring and monitoring the behavior of people that have come back into the community, training, job placements, and the kind of subsidies that I spoke about. By the way, this is not easy to design, it's not easy to administer, it takes a lot of money and a lot of organization. There's no real shortcut from what I have seen, in getting this stuff right. So in a situation like this, it's going to be quite taxing. But I would advise you not to be fobbed off by those who come and say, well, you know, a public works program will be fine. Or just send them all to college and that'll be great. Their skills will be upgraded. Those things don't work. It has to be a much more nuanced package, which includes dealing with the psychology, the identity, and the attachment to a new community.
Okay, so thank you. I'm afraid we're down to our last batch of questions. And the first question would come from the gentleman in front, the second from Ms. Memen, the third from Ma'am. And because it's the last batch, I will take the liberty of adding one more. Haj?
From Al-Kalam.
Okay, from Al-Kalam.
Mic test. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Moises Torrentira. I am from the Ateneo Philosophy and Business Management departments. Okay. There is this Nobel Prize winner named John Rawls. He's actually a philosopher and also an economist. Now, he said that man is a political being. And hence, if man is a political being, he is territorial. And if man is territorial, he has his own vested interests. If each one of us has his own vested interests, now that will produce chaotic society. That means we are living a chaotic society. Now, later on, we realize that we cannot live anymore in a chaotic society. We cannot live with people who cannot trust and have no confidence with each other. That's why John Rawls is suggesting this one. A social arrangement. The social arrangement will produce social agreements, just like the Bangsamoro framework. The social arrangement or the social agreement should be taken, public reason or the reason of the public should be taken into account in order to create these agreements. Now, how can we materialize this social agreement? We must have this, John Rawls is suggesting this overlapping consensus with the original position by virtue of the veil of ignorance. Now, what are these concepts? I think these are very important concepts for us to create frameworks and to make agreements. What do we do with veil of ignorance? We, of course, suspend or set aside or even forget our own values, our own attitudes, our behaviors, our metaphysical traditions. Religion as well is forgotten or set aside in order for us to create just agreements. Now, my question is this. This is addressed to Mr. Nigel or Robert. I appreciate the success stories you mentioned in Singapore, Indonesia, Liberia, and Northern Ireland, I think. Do you think, sir, this veil of ignorance, the overlapping consensus, and the original position are important contributors to that success story? And if not, could this be a new thing to create frameworks, successful frameworks? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Memen, for our next question.
I've been waiting for this to be raised, but since nobody's raising it. But first, I'd like to thank the presenters, so our speakers. It's about the inclusion of women. We've been talking about transforming conflicts, rebuilding relationships, rebuilding trust in institutions, and economic and livelihood development. But it is really very important that we include the women's perspectives, their needs and aspirations. And studies have proven that a lot of economic programs, socioeconomic or livelihood programs, could have been more effective, could have been more helpful if women have been included. Women have been the ones holding the funds, for instance, for the programs, and even in implementing and directly involved in the development and implementation of socioeconomic or livelihood programs.
Thank you. Our third question.
Good afternoon, and thank you once again for this second opportunity to ask a question. My name is Avin Acunyagulo from IPDev. It's a project for the empowerment of indigenous peoples in the ARMM. I'd like to address my question to Mr. Nigel Robert. It is interesting to note that you have advised us to beware of donors. It's something that I've so wanted to hear for the longest time, aside from myself saying that. But nonetheless, it seems that for those of us who are been circulating around the development and humanitarian community, it seems that this is an unspoken reality, that in the way that we are seeing government funds being misused, there is also this phenomenon that is happening with the donor community. Well, I don't want to mix those assistance with those that have given positive impacts, but I strongly feel that the phenomenon of donor dependence has a very strong bearing towards the issue of self-determination, knowing where to go without being so dependent on external support. My question will be something like this. Have you, in the course of your studies, come across nations that have weaned themselves or have slowly and gradually detached themselves from donor dependence and stabilized themselves in the process?
Thank you very much. And our last question from Alcala.
Thank you once again for giving us this opportunity to ask the question. First is for Professor Adriano. Sir, comparing the GMA and now the Pinoy peace process, from Pamana, now before Panamin or all other programs, are we not reinventing the wheel over and over again? Or do you see any changes or clear signs of things are working? From Ma'am Asek or Loretta. Ma'am, based on our dialogues, first is a reaction, based on our dialogue and continued efforts in the communities, the call for independence is still there. The MILF, the MNLF may set it aside, but unfortunately, it may be logically or even economically not viable or even feasible. But that's one of the reasons why we have the BIFF and many other Moro fronts would emerge eventually, one after the other. So my question is, does OPAP really know who represents the Bangsamoro people? Is it the MILF or MNLF? Or how about the 99% Muslim Filipinos who are sick and tired of this kind of drama over and over again, having this kind of Bangsamoro oppressed mentality, victim mentality, and not making the system work. It's just for us, if you ask us, the conflict is just a mirage, it's just a way of hiding the corruption, the gun trade, the human trafficking, and all other things. But the real issue is not being addressed by the government. And lastly, for Sir Nigel, Sir, while you were talking, I felt that those things that you discussed are already taught to us when we were in grade school. Do you think that those points that you discussed are actually being done by our government right now?
Thank you for the last batch of questions.
I think it can be summed up with the difference is really there is a genuine dialogue that happens between the government and the MILF. And even in terms of the implementation of projects, I've seen quite a number of them. The government right now is really sincere in trying to extend, in trying to ensure that the assistance really reach the Moro beneficiaries. Because I've partly seen the horrors of the Ampatuan during the time, that a lot of the assistance given by the previous administration did not really reach a lot of the Bangsamoro people in that area, particularly those coming from the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Agrarian Reform. That does not happen anymore now. And there's a specific program now, Pamana. It's not a perfect system. It's an imperfect one. But you can see that in terms of Pamana, we're trying, in a way, it's trying to address the problem of this PDAF scam, because the decision on what projects to undertake and the community participates sometimes in the implementation of these projects because it's piggyback on the Kalaisid's project. And of course, there's an attempt again by the government to really get the needs of the ordinary people through the budget, bottoms-up budgeting program. And that will somehow prevent or serve as a foil against the excesses of this PDAP scam. Because the projects are identified by the community, you plan the budget that will be received by the LGUs and the national agencies based on those identified by the communities, and the community participate in monitoring and evaluation. These are real achievements because it never happened during that time. There is absence of monitoring evaluation. The monitoring, for example, in the department previously, the monitoring is in terms of how much fertilizer was distributed, how much seeds were distributed, etc., etc. But it never monitored whether it made a difference on the lives of the farmers. Because you can easily fiddle with your, with your report that I distributed so much. But you don't see it, whether it was really received by the farmers, that was not monitored. Whether it created a difference on the lives of the farmers, that was not monitored. So you can do a lot of monitoring, but it depends on your objective. Okay? That is happening right now. Really trying to monitor. We have really an impressive evaluation, monitoring evaluation based on scientific methodology of the Kalaisid. We have really impressive monitoring of the impact of the conditional cash transfer, that if you want to see the documents, evaluation, sophisticated econometric analysis done, you can see that. We can give you the copies of those, and even the Pamana program. That's the huge difference.
Okay. The inclusion of women. Just for the information of everyone, because it has always been the call of a lot of women's organizations. The members of the panel with the CPP-NPA, actually 2 out of 5 are women. In the negotiation with the MILF, 2 out of 5 of the panel members are also women. In the technical working group, the head of the wealth sharing is a woman. In the technical working group on the normalization, two of us were women, only 1 is a male. In a very supposedly male-dominated terrain of disarmament demobilization. So in other words, in terms of representation, I believe that the government has already satisfied at least the inclusion of the women's voice in the negotiation. But it always takes 2 to tango. In other words, we also need to hear what the women's sector or the women's organization want in the negotiating table. Because on the one hand, bringing women's voices in the negotiation is one thing, but also bringing the agenda of women on the table is another. And therefore, the women's organizations must also articulate what the agenda should be in terms of the negotiation. So that's one. Second, I was actually fascinated when I was listening to a colleague from the academy. Just for the information of everyone, I teach in the Ateneo de Manila before I joined OPAP, and therefore my whole life has been an academic. But I guess the challenge for the academics like us is how do we transform these academic jargons and frameworks and theories into something that can be used in policy, that can be used in operations. Because otherwise, if we are not able to bridge that academic, we call it the tower, ano nga yun? The ivory tower. If we cannot bridge the ivory tower of academic discourse to what is real policy operations, then we might be losing our chance, okay, in contributing to national development. The call for independence is there, I agree. But in as far as the negotiation is concerned, it is no longer an agenda. With the MILF, with the MNLF, we're talking about autonomy. But I'm sure the call for independence for the other groups is still there. How do we know if which group represents, or if this group that we are talking to is the official or the recognized, the legitimate representative of the Bangsamoro? Who can say? Hindi ba? Who can say? But the fundamental agenda of any government, not just the Aquino administration, but any government, is to decrease the level of violence on the ground. And that's the main reason why the government negotiated with the MNLF. That is also the main reason why the government is still negotiating with the MILF. Because the fundamental agenda is to make sure that violence will no longer erupt again on the ground. Now, finally, regarding how effective is PAMANA, the intervention, the reality is no matter how good the feasibility study is, the reality is all these interventions are trial and error. There is no, even if you produce a very, very good feasibility study to propose a particular program, in the end, you will still try to see if actually it will work on the ground. So PAMANA, it is not a perfect system. We are trying to see how we can further improve it. But along the way, definitely you will find some problems.
Well, thank you. There were 4 very good questions, and I'm going to give you 4 very quick answers. The first one about how vested interest causes chaos. I think what your Nobel laureate was saying in simple sense is that humans are selfish. This is true, but as you all know, we're a combination of the animal and the angelic. And I think that the best peace processes somehow manage to appeal to both sides of humanity. In other words, they give people enough of what they want, and they also give them enough space to do things whereby they can gain honor with their communities, so that these 2 different motivations are catered to. I think if you deconstruct these peace processes, you will find that they manage to do that. Second, I will say something personal about the role of women. I certainly agree with the questioner. Women are generally half of the population. They almost always do much more than half of the work. And therefore, for me, it's straightforward. They should have a proportionate sense of political power in relation to the contributions they make. This wonderful question of the donors. This is a middle-income country. I think the key thing to remember is the donors need you much more than you need them. That is the reality, and I think once a government realizes that, then you can start to get the best out of them. Donors will never coordinate themselves. It's like asking a group of poachers to arrange a set of rules for hunting. The referee has to be the government, and once the government understands that it really does have the power, and it backs that up with a clear strategy, then you will get the best out of the donors, and actually, lo and behold, the donors will start to behave. Are there examples of where this has happened and where countries have weaned themselves from donor dependence? Yes, they're called middle-income countries. That's what happens. The transition from low to middle-income status means that you become less and less dependent on donors, certainly in terms of dictating your policies. And you're then able to use them selectively to bring in the skills and the expertise and indeed the financing that you decide that you need. Good examples of this actually do exist among countries that are still low income, where they really have drawn the line. Timor-Leste is one, Ethiopia is another, Eritrea is another, Uganda is another, Cambodia is another. These are not always the darlings of the aid organizations, but in all cases they have managed to indicate clearly what they wanted. And the final question, somebody said that much of what I said one knew in grade school. And that actually was a compliment, because that tells me that I told you a simple story and it made sense at a common sense level. And that's what it should do. Is it being done? No. And that's because a lot of what is done by policymakers in governments and in donor communities is not logical and sensible at all. It often looks like it is because it's dressed up that way. But such simple things as understanding the grievances in a society just do not get done. But there's some good news here. There's an understanding of this, not coming from people like me, but coming from people in countries that are going through this process of crisis and fragility. If you want a really good statement that shows there's an understanding of how to get these things done, look at the New Deal document that came out of the Busan conference on the higher level conference on aid at the end of 2011. It's known as a fragile states document, and probably many of you here would not think to look at it because it seems to apply to basket cases like Nepal and Somalia. But actually, it is very valid and very relevant to the situation that you face here. A 3 or 4 page document is something far better than you'll find in the World Development Report or any other donor document that I'm aware
of. Just a confession, I've been working on Mindanao peace and development issues for about 20 years now. I started working in 1992 when Mr. Dominguez came into power. And for some reason, I was able to manage my transition better than most of the... So I worked with the the administration of Mr. Ramos, administration of Estrada through Robert Aventado, and finally with Mrs. Arroyo. And now I'm still working with partly, having dialogues with the government. And I can tell, throughout those 20 years, 2 decades of experience that this government is trying to make a difference. And that's the reason why I'm in and out. If I didn't, for example, if I didn't like it during the Estrada administration, I just withdraw myself. So that's the point. And that's the reason why I often tell my friends in the civil society particularly that I think you should be less critical. You should be more positive, particularly in things happening on the peace process. Like you criticize the government over the handling of some Wanga, etc. But look at what those people like Secretary Dingo Suliman is doing. They see that there's shortage of food, but imagine you have to feed about 100,000 people or refugees, and they've been packaging food for about 80,000. And you still see the shortage of about 10,000, but never the 80 or 90,000 they've done. And that's my pleading to our friends, because it's particularly in the civil society that we're actually allies, and there are only a few of us. And if you're going to criticize, you have to come out with an alternative, because one philosopher said that your criticism is only as good as your alternative. I will end up with that. Thanks.
So thank you very much. That ends our open forum for this afternoon. Please join me in thanking our esteemed speakers and in congratulating everyone for a very fruitful discussion. Thank you. Magandang hapon po.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Tolosa. At this point, may I request our speakers to come down the stage where they will be awarded the tokens of appreciation by, again, Mr. Jeremy Eliab of the Office of the President of the Ateneo, accompanied by Father Gabriel Gonzalez, the Vice President for Academic Affairs of the Ateneo. Ladies and sirs. So to recap, we are going to be awarding tokens of appreciation to the Honorable Jennifer Santiago Ureta for her presentation, updates on the peace process, Dr. Fermin Adriano for the post-conflict reconstruction in the Philippines, and Mr. Nigel Robert on international perspectives on the economics of post-conflict reconstruction. Let's all give them a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know if you've noticed, ladies and gentlemen, that that is one cool token of appreciation. All right, moving on. To lighten the mood before we close today's event, may I call on to give an intermission number. Let's all welcome the Carillon Glee Club. Thank you very much, the Carillon Glee Club. And to give the closing remarks, may I now call on the rector of the Davao Jesuit community. Let's all welcome Father Daniel J. McNamara.
First of all, let me congratulate everyone for this event and participation. It is well done in our institution, the Ateneo de Davao, a Jesuit, Catholic, Filipino institution. It goes back by its very name to the roots of what is the whole question of peace, what is the whole question of security, therefore, as has been mentioned. We sometimes call it justice, sometimes call it the common good, sometimes call it social justice. But in all of these things, it goes back to humanity. And that is the essence of what a Catholic institution teaches. Not this or that ideology, but what does it mean to be human? If you're going to be human, there has to be some relation to a transcendent. It may have different names, may have different ways of being cataloged, as it were, but there'll be some relation, if you're truly human, to a transcendent. Going back to those common roots is ultimately where peace has to come from. We have to agree we're all humans. And as humans, we want to forge what makes us more human, and that's the only way peace will come. Yes, justice will have to be there, yes, because it violates our very humanity. We have different agreements probably even on what it means to be human in the sense of what are my human rights? Yeah, that's something worth talking about and hopefully not fighting over, because we're all looking for that common good, that common root, that basis of what makes us what we are, human. So congratulations once more, and good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Father McNamara, for wonderful closing remarks. And on that note, thank you very much for coming, everybody. Good evening.